Tonight, we explore a profound teaching in Zen Buddhism called the original face. It points toward who we truly are beneath everything we have become, and in recognizing it, we return to a quiet peace that was here all along. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. From our earliest moments, life begins to add layers. We are given a name. We are taught what to believe. We learn to play certain roles and adopt certain ways of being. Year by year, these layers accumulate until we can hardly remember what was there before them. But beneath all these layers, something remains. Something that has never changed. This is what the Zen tradition invites us to recognize tonight. Not something new to find, but something ancient to remember. We will explore this teaching through stories and reflections. We will meet people who discovered, in their own ways, what they had somehow always known. We will rest in the gentle truth that who we truly are has been here all along, waiting patiently beneath everything we have become. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. From the moment we arrive in this world, we are given a name. Someone looks at us and speaks a word, and that word becomes attached to us. We hear it so many times that we start to believe it is who we are. Our name becomes the first layer, the first coat of paint on a canvas that was once completely bare. After the name come other labels. We are told we are shy or bold, clever or simple, good at some things and not at others. We learn which family we belong to, which village, which tradition. Each label adds another layer, another coating over whatever was there before. By the time we are grown, we have so many layers that we cannot see beneath them anymore. We look at ourselves and see only the accumulation of names and roles and histories. These feel so solid and permanent that we forget they were ever added at all. We forget there was ever a time before them. But Zen gently reminds us that before the first name was spoken, something was already present. Before anyone told us who we were, we already existed. That original presence did not need a name to be real and did not need labels or descriptions. It simply was, complete and whole, needing nothing added. Tonight, we begin our exploration here with this simple recognition. The names and labels we carry are useful things that help us move through the world and connect with others. But they are not the deepest truth of what we are. Beneath them, prior to them, something remains that has never been named. The Zen tradition calls this the original face, and it waits quietly for us to remember it was always here. Let us explore a story that shows how one woman began to glimpse this truth. In a village, nestled between two rivers, there lived a woman named Fen, who served as the keeper of records. For 40 years, she had documented every birth, every death, every marriage, every transfer of land. Her careful handwriting filled dozens of thick books that lined the walls of her small office. The shelves reached from floor to ceiling, holding the written history of generations. Fen took great pride in her work. She believed that the records made things real and official, giving them weight and permanence. When a child was born, it was her pen that inscribed the name and date, and this act of writing felt like it completed something important. Before the record, there was just a baby. After the record, there was a person with a place in the world. The villagers respected Fen and her books. When disputes arose about boundaries or inheritances, they came to her small office with its ink-stained desk and permanent smell of paper. When someone needed to prove who they were or where they came from, Her records provided the answer. In a way, she held the identity of the entire village in her small, careful hands. She had started as a young apprentice, learning from the previous record keeper, an old man who had treated the books almost like sacred objects. He taught her that every stroke of the brush mattered, that every name written was a kind of promise to remember. When he passed away, she took over the work and never questioned its importance. The records were truth. The records were permanence. Without them, how would anyone know who was who? One autumn afternoon, as yellow leaves drifted past her window, a stranger arrived in the village. He was an elderly man with white hair and calm eyes, wearing simple clothes that showed signs of long travel. Dust covered his sandals and the hem of his robe. He carried nothing but a walking stick and a small cloth bag that seemed nearly empty. The village headman brought the stranger to Fen's office, as was customary with newcomers. She opened a fresh page in her book, smoothed it carefully with her palm, and dipped her brush in ink. The familiar ritual comforted her. "Your name?" she asked, brush poised over the paper. The old man smiled gently but did not answer. His eyes held no defiance or evasion, only a kind of peaceful quiet. "Where do you come from?" she tried. Again, only silence and that calm smile. The headman shifted uncomfortably by the door. He has been like this since he arrived at the village gate. He speaks when spoken to about practical matters, asks politely for directions or water, but he will not give his name or history. We do not know what to make of him. Fen felt a flicker of irritation. In 40 years, she had never encountered someone who refused to be recorded. Everyone had a name. Everyone came from somewhere. How could she document someone who would not provide the basic information? "Without a name, I cannot write you in the records," she said firmly. "Without documentation, you have no official place in this village." The stranger nodded as if this were perfectly reasonable, even expected. "Then I have no official place," he said simply. His voice was warm and unhurried. "Does that not concern you? Should it?" Fen did not know how to respond. She set down her brush and looked at this strange man more carefully. He did not seem mad or confused. His eyes were clear and attentive. He simply seemed at ease with having no documented existence. In the days that followed, the stranger remained in the village. The headman could find no reason to expel him, as he caused no trouble and broke no rules. He helped with the harvest, moving slowly but steadily alongside the farmers, his aged hands still capable of useful work. He shared meals with whoever invited him, always courteous and fully present. He sat by the river in the evenings, watching the water flow past, seeming to want nothing more than to witness the world around him. The villagers did not know what to make of him. Without a name or history, they could not place him in their understanding of things. Some were suspicious, wondering what he might be hiding. Others were curious, drawn to his quiet presence. A few simply accepted him as he was, enjoying his company without needing to categorize him. Children especially seemed comfortable around him, perhaps because they had not yet learned that everyone must fit neatly into records and categories. Fen found herself watching him more than she cared to admit. His existence troubled her in ways she could not quite name. Her entire life's work rested on the belief that people needed to be documented to be real, to have a proper place. Yet here was a man who seemed perfectly real, perfectly present, perfectly at ease, despite having no place in any record. He existed fully, and her books knew nothing about him. She caught herself thinking about him while she worked, while she ate her evening rice, while she lay awake at night. It was as if he had asked her a question without speaking, and she could not rest until she found the answer. One evening, after her day's work was done, she found herself walking to the river where the stranger often sat. The sun was setting, turning the water to gold and amber. Dragonflies hovered over the shallows, and somewhere in the reeds a frog was singing. The stranger looked up as she approached and gestured to a flat rock beside him without surprise, as if he had been expecting her. She sat, and for a while they watched the river together in silence. The water moved past endlessly, catching the fading light. "It troubles you," he said finally, "that I will not give you a name." "Yes," she admitted. "My whole life I have believed that names matter, that records matter, that without them a person is somehow incomplete or unreal." The stranger picked up a small stone from the riverbank and turned it slowly in his weathered fingers. "This stone has no name. Does it exist?" "Of course." "But it is just a stone. And the river, does it have a name?" "We call it the Silver River." "Ah, but the river was flowing long before anyone named it, long before there was a village here, long before there were people to give names to things. The water you see right now has never been called anything. It is new water, arriving from the mountains this very moment, passing through, moving on to places it has never been. It does not wait for a name to exist." Fen watched the water flowing past, always moving, always changing, always present. She had never thought about it this way. The river had seemed so permanent, so fixed, but it was made of water that was never the same. The stranger continued gently. "You have kept records for 40 years. You have written thousands of names. But tell me, in the moment before anyone wrote your name in a book, did you exist?" Fen felt something stir inside her, something that had been sleeping for a long time. She remembered nothing of her own infancy, of course. Those years were blank in her memory. But she knew she had been there. A baby, aware and alive, looking out at the world long before anyone had dipped a brush in ink and given her a place in the records. "I existed," she said quietly. "And what was that existence like? Before the name, before the labels, before anyone told you who you were and where you belonged? Before they said you were the daughter of this family, destined for that role, suited to this kind of work?" She could not answer. She had no memory of that time, and yet something in her knew it was real. She had been present before the records began. She had been whole before the names arrived. The stranger set the stone down gently on the bank, placing it carefully as if returning it to where it belonged. What we are calling the original face is what we are before any name is given. It is not found in records because it cannot be captured by ink and paper. Your books are useful things, and I mean no disrespect to your work. They help the village run smoothly. They settle disputes and preserve memories. But they have never contained the truth of a single person. That truth exists before and beyond any record. Fen sat with this for a long time as the light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. She thought of all the names she had written over the years, all the careful documentation, the pride she had taken in her complete and accurate books. None of it had ever touched what was most essential about the people she recorded. The names were like signs pointing towards something they could never hold. When she finally returned to her office that night, walking slowly through the quiet streets, she looked at her shelves of books differently. They were still valuable, still useful, still worthy of care. But they were not what she had believed them to be. They were not containers of identity, only references to something much deeper that no book could ever capture. The people in those pages were so much more than the names she had given them. Zen teaches us that our names and labels are like clothes we wear. They serve a purpose and help us navigate the practical world of families and villages and responsibilities. But just as we are not our clothes, we are not our names. The Buddha spoke often about how we cling to identity as if it were solid and permanent. We grasp at our names, our histories, our descriptions of ourselves, believing they are the truth of what we are. But these are all additions that came after our original presence. They are layers painted over the canvas, not the canvas itself. What Fen began to see by the river was something simple but profound. The stranger existed fully despite having no place in her records. His presence was not diminished by the absence of documentation. This pointed towards something that exists in all of us, a presence that was there before any name arrived. We can notice this in our own experience if we look carefully. Our names feel natural to us now, so familiar that they seem like part of our very being. But there was a time when we did not know them. There was a time when we simply existed, without any story about who we were or where we came from. That existence was complete in itself, needing no label to be real. The original face is what remains when we set aside all the names and descriptions. It is not a thing we can point to or write down, but it is perhaps the most real thing about us. It was here before the naming began, and it remains here still, beneath all the layers that have accumulated over the years. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a province known for its military tradition, there lived a young man named Toro, whose father was a celebrated general. The father's name was spoken with reverence throughout the land. His victories had brought prosperity to the region, and his strategies were studied by commanders in distant kingdoms. Songs were sung about his courage. Children played games pretending to be him. Toro had grown up in the long shadow of this great name. Everywhere he went, people looked at his face and saw his father looking back at them. They expected him to carry himself with the same authority, to speak with the same commanding presence, to achieve the same remarkable things. "You have your father's eyes," they would say, studying his features as if searching for proof of the connection. "You have your father's bearing. Surely you will become a great general too. The blood runs strong." At first, when he was young, Toro had tried to live up to these expectations. He trained hard in military arts, rising before dawn to practice with sword and bow. He studied strategy and tactics, memorizing the classic texts of warfare. He practiced giving orders and projecting confidence, lowering his voice the way his father did. But no matter how hard he tried, he always felt like he was wearing a costume that did not quite fit. The armor was too heavy. The commanding voice felt false in his throat. Something in him kept whispering that this was not who he was meant to be. His father was a natural leader, born to command armies and inspire loyalty. Men followed him without question. Toro was quieter, more contemplative. He preferred walking alone in forests to drilling on parade grounds. He found more beauty in poetry than in battle plans. When he watched his father address the troops, he felt only admiration and distance, not kinship. But no one wanted to see these qualities in the general's son. When he mentioned his love of poetry, people smiled politely and changed the subject back to warfare. When he suggested he might pursue a different path, his relatives grew concerned and spoke to him about duty and legacy. The robe of his father's name had been placed on his shoulders, and everyone expected him to wear it forever. By the time he was 25, Toro felt exhausted by the weight of that name. Every conversation began with questions about the general. Every introduction came with expectations attached, like weights around his neck. He could not remember the last time someone had simply seen him as he was, without the overlay of his father's greatness. One spring, when the plum blossoms were just beginning to open, Toro made a decision. He would travel to a distant province where his father's name was unknown. He told his family he was going on a pilgrimage, which was partly true. He was searching for something, though he could not have said exactly what. The journey took many weeks. He traveled through mountains where the paths were narrow and steep, past rivers swollen with snowmelt, through valleys where farmers looked up from their work to watch him pass. With each mile, he felt something loosening in his chest, as if a tight knot was slowly coming undone. He reached a region that felt completely different from his homeland. The customs were different, the accent was different, even the trees and birds seemed unfamiliar. No one here had heard of his father. No one looked at his face and saw a reflection of someone else. He stopped at a small inn in a village surrounded by green rice paddies. The innkeeper was an elderly woman named Sana, with a weathered face that spoke of many years and kind eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. She showed him to a simple room with clean bedding and a view of the mountains, and brought him tea without asking any questions about his family or purpose. Over the following days, Toro found himself staying at the inn longer than he had planned. He helped with small tasks, finding comfort in simple work. He repaired a section of fence that had begun to lean. He carried water from the well each morning. He swept the courtyard in the evenings. Sana accepted his help without comment or curiosity, paying him in meals and lodging and the occasional nod of approval. What struck Toro most was the complete absence of expectation. Sana did not know his family, did not know his history, did not know anything about the famous general or his famous victories. She asked nothing about where he came from or what he was supposed to become. She simply saw a young man who was helpful and pleasant and willing to work, and that was enough. For the first time in his memory, Toro felt a strange lightness. He woke each morning without the familiar weight of his father's name pressing on him before he even opened his eyes. He moved through his days without performing for an audience of expectations. He was simply himself, whoever that was, and that was permitted. One evening, after the work was done and the guests had retired, he sat with Sana on the porch of the inn, watching fireflies drift through the darkening air like floating lanterns. The old woman had said very little over the weeks, but Toro sensed a quiet wisdom in her silence, a depth that came from long years of watching and listening. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "When you look at me, what do you see?" Sana considered this for a moment, watching the fireflies trace their unhurried paths through the garden. "I see a young man who carries himself like someone recently relieved of a heavy burden. You walk differently now than when you arrived. Your shoulders sit differently. Something has lifted." Toro felt tears prick his eyes unexpectedly. It was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about him. "I am the son of a famous general," he said quietly, giving voice to the secret he had carried here. At home, that is all anyone sees when they look at me. His son, his legacy, his continuation. They do not see me at all. Sana nodded slowly, unsurprised. That must be tiring. To be looked at and not seen. It is. I came here to escape it, even for a little while. Here, when no one knows his name, I can finally breathe. I can finally just be myself. The old woman was quiet for a long moment, watching the fireflies dance their silent dance. Then she said something Toro would remember for the rest of his life. The name you carry is like a robe someone dressed you in when you were too young to refuse. It has weight. It has expectations woven into every thread. But you are not the robe. You were here before the robe was placed on your shoulders, and you remain here beneath it. You would be here still if it fell away entirely. She turned to look at him directly, her eyes catching the last light of evening. What you are feeling now, this lightness, this freedom, this being simply yourself, this is not because you have traveled far from home. It is because, for the first time, you are meeting yourself without the robe. The distance helped you remove it, but what you have found was always there. It was just hidden beneath all that heavy cloth. Toro sat with these words as the night deepened around them and the stars emerged one by one. He thought about the robe of his father's name, how it had been placed on him before he could speak, how he had worn it so long he had forgotten it was not his own skin. It had become so familiar that he could not tell where it ended, and he began. Here in this distant place, he had slipped out of it briefly. And what he found underneath was not nothing. It was not emptiness or confusion or the absence of self. It was something quiet and present and real. Something that had always been there, waiting patiently to be noticed. I do not know if I can remove the robe forever, he said finally. I will have to return home eventually. The expectations will still be there. My father will still be who he is. Sana smiled gently. The robe may return to your shoulders. You may wear it again out of duty or love or necessity. But now you know it is a robe, not your skin. You know there is something beneath it. That knowing changes everything. You can never again completely forget. Buddhism shows us that much of our suffering comes from mistaking our roles and identities for our true selves. We become so attached to our names, our positions, our histories, that we forget these are things we wear rather than things we are. Toro discovered something precious in that distant province. He discovered that beneath the heavy robe of his father's name, he still existed. He was not erased by removing the identity that had been placed upon him. Instead, he found something more essential, more real than any name or expectation could capture. The original face does not depend on recognition from others. It does not need the world to confirm it or validate it. It simply is, whether anyone sees it or not. What others see when they look at us is usually the robe, the layers, the names and histories. But what looks back at them, what experiences the looking, comes from somewhere deeper than any of these. We all carry names that were given to us by others. We all wear robes of expectation and identity that were placed on us before we could refuse. These are not bad things in themselves. They help us function in the world, connect with others, understand our responsibilities. but they are not the final truth of who we are. The original face was present before the first robe was placed on our shoulders. It remains present beneath all the layers we have accumulated over the years. And like Toro sitting on that porch watching fireflies, we can sometimes catch a glimpse of it when the weight of our names briefly lifts. Let your breath settle now, soft and easy. You do not need to remove any name or set aside any role in this moment. Simply notice that something is here, present and aware, beneath whatever you have been called. We spend our lives gathering things, not just objects, but knowledge, skills, opinions, and ways of understanding the world. From our earliest years, we are taught and trained, filled with information about how things work and what we should believe. This learning is valuable, and it helps us navigate our days with competence and understanding. But somewhere along the way, we may begin to feel that we are what we have learned. We identify with our knowledge, our skills, our accumulated understanding. We feel that without these things, we would be somehow less, somehow incomplete. Zen gently invites us to look more carefully at this assumption. Before we learned anything at all, we were already here. Before we knew a single fact or held a single opinion, awareness was present. The mind that would eventually learn so much was already awake, already looking out at the world with fresh eyes. This is another doorway into understanding the original face. It is not something we acquire through learning or achieve through effort. It is what was present before the learning began, the awareness that made learning possible in the first place. All our knowledge rests upon it, yet it is not made of knowledge. All our skills flow from it, yet it is not a skill. Tonight we continue our exploration by looking at this relationship between what we know and what we are. The knowing is precious, but something more fundamental lies beneath it. Like the ground that supports a house, it was there before the first stone was laid, and it remains there still, holding everything we have built upon it. Let us explore a story that shows how one woman glimpsed this truth. In a city known for its great libraries, there lived a scholar named Hina, who had devoted her life to learning. Her study was filled with books she had collected over 50 years, their spines worn from reading and rereading. She could recite passages from memory, debate fine points of philosophy, and answer questions that puzzled younger minds. Hina had been curious from her earliest years, always asking why and how, never satisfied until she understood. This hunger for knowledge had driven her through decades of study, and she had become one of the most learned people in the province. Students traveled great distances to sit with her and learn from her vast understanding. She took quiet pride in what she had accumulated. Each book on her shelf represented hours of careful reading. Each piece of knowledge had been hard-won through concentration and effort. Her mind felt like a well-organized storehouse, filled with treasures she could draw upon whenever needed. One afternoon, her young granddaughter Miri came to visit. The girl was only 6 years old, still new to the world, and full of questions about everything she encountered. She wandered through Hina's study, looking at the towering shelves with wide eyes. "Grandmother, have you read all these books?" "Most of them, yes." "Do you know everything?" Hina smiled. "No one knows everything, but I have learned a great deal over many years." Miri climbed into her grandmother's lap, a habit from when she was even smaller. She was quiet for a moment, which was unusual for such a talkative child. Then she asked a question that Hina would think about for the rest of her life. "Grandmother, what did you know before you knew anything?" Hina opened her mouth to answer, but no words came. The question seemed simple, almost nonsensical, the kind of thing a child might ask without really understanding what she was saying. And yet it stopped Hina completely. What did she know before she knew anything? She thought back through her life, trying to find the beginning of her knowledge. She remembered learning to read, the slow process of connecting symbols to sounds and sounds to meanings. Before that, she remembered learning to speak, the words gradually becoming tools she could use. Before that, she remembered very little, just vague impressions of warmth and faces and light. But she had been there, even before the memories began. She had been present, aware, alive, looking out at a world she did not yet understand or have words for. That presence had not required knowledge. It had simply been there, complete in itself. "I do not know how to answer that," Hina admitted finally. Miri seemed unconcerned. She had already moved on to examining a carved wooden box on her grandmother's desk. But the question remained with Hina like a seed planted in fertile soil. In the days that followed, she found herself returning to it again and again. She would be reading one of her beloved books and suddenly wonder what was there before she could read. She would be forming an opinion about something and pause to ask what was there before she had any opinions at all. She began to notice something she had overlooked her entire life. All her knowledge, vast as it was, rested on something that was not knowledge. There was an awareness present before any learning occurred, and this awareness was still here now, unchanged by all the information that had been poured into it over the decades. Her books had filled her mind with content, but they had not created the mind itself. The ability to learn had preceded the learning. The capacity to know had been there before she knew anything at all. One evening, she sat in her study as the light faded, not reading for once, just sitting quietly with her granddaughter's question. She looked at her shelves of books, and for the first time she saw them differently. They were precious, yes, but they were also additions. They had been placed upon a foundation that was already complete. She thought of herself as a small child, before words, before concepts, before any understanding of the world had taken shape. That child had been fully present, fully aware, fully alive. Not incomplete, not waiting to be filled, just there, looking out at everything with eyes that had no names for what they saw. That same awareness was here now, she realized. Beneath all her learning, beneath all her carefully constructed understanding, something remained that had never changed. Her knowledge had grown enormously, but the awareness holding that knowledge was the same awareness that had looked out from her infant eyes. This was the original face her Zen readings had spoken of. Not something to be achieved through study, but something that was present before study began. All her learning had been valuable, but it had also obscured something more fundamental. She had been so busy filling herself with knowledge that she had forgotten to notice what was already there, empty and complete, before the filling started. Zen teaches us that our deepest nature is not something we acquire or construct. We spend our lives building an understanding of the world, and this building is necessary and good. But we can become so identified with what we have built that we forget the ground it stands on. The Buddha spoke of consciousness as something that exists prior to its contents. Before a thought arises, awareness is present. Before an opinion forms, something is there to hold it. This prior awareness is not empty in a negative sense. It is spacious, open, ready to receive whatever comes. Hina had spent 50 years filling her mind with treasures. Each piece of knowledge was genuinely valuable. But her granddaughter's innocent question pointed to something even more precious. The awareness that had been present before the first book was opened, the first word learned, the first idea understood. We can notice this in our own experience. Right now, as you listen to these words, something is aware of them. That awareness did not come from learning. It was there when you were born, looking out at a world of shapes and sounds and sensations. It is here still, unchanged by all the experiences that have flowed through it. The original face is not found by adding more knowledge. It is glimpsed by noticing what was present before the knowledge arrived. It is the open space in which all learning happens, the silent witness to all our thinking, the ground beneath everything we have built. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a mountain town famous for its tea, there lived a tea master named Vin, who had spent 40 years refining his craft. He could identify any tea by its region of origin, the season of its harvest, even the elevation at which it was grown. His palate was legendary, and people came from distant provinces to taste his preparations and learn from his expertise. Vin had built his knowledge sip by sip, year by year. As a young apprentice, he could barely distinguish one tea from another. Now he could detect subtle notes that others missed entirely. He had words for flavors that most people could not even perceive. His vocabulary of taste had grown elaborate and precise. He took great satisfaction in this expertise. When students came to learn, he would guide them through the subtle differences between teas, teaching them the words and categories they would need to develop their own understanding. He believed that knowledge was the path to appreciation, that the more words you had for something, the more deeply you could experience it. One autumn afternoon, a woman named Sarah arrived at his tea house. She was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a serene expression. What Vin noticed immediately was that she was blind. Her eyes were open but unfocused, and she moved with the careful attention of someone navigating by sound and touch. She had heard of his tea house, she explained, and had traveled a great distance to taste his preparations. Tea had been her companion since childhood, one of the pleasures that remained vivid even after her sight had faded 20 years ago. Vin prepared his finest tea for her, following every step of the ritual with extra care. He watched as she lifted the cup, inhaled the fragrance, and brought it to her lips. She drank slowly, holding each sip in her mouth before swallowing. Her face changed as she tasted. Not dramatically, but in small shifts of expression that Vin found himself watching intently. She seemed to be having a different experience than his usual guests, though he could not say exactly how. When she set down her cup, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "You have great knowledge of tea. I can tell by how perfectly this was prepared, but I wonder if I might ask you something." "Of course." "When you taste tea now, do you taste the tea itself, or do you taste your categories?" Vin did not understand. "What do you mean?" "I have no formal training," Sarah explained. "I never learned the proper words for what I taste. When I lost my sight, my other senses became more vivid. Now when I drink tea, I simply taste it. There is the warmth, the bitterness, the sweetness. the way it changes as it moves across my tongue. I have no names for these things. I just experience them directly. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Sometimes I wonder if names create a distance between us and what we are experiencing. Before I knew the word for bitter, I knew bitterness itself. The word came later and built a wall between me and the direct taste. Now I try to taste what is there before the words arrive. Vin felt something shift in him. He thought about his own experience of tea, which had become so refined and precise. He could identify dozens of distinct qualities in a single sip. But he realized that his experience was now deeply intertwined with his categories. He did not simply taste anymore. He tasted and named, tasted and compared, tasted and evaluated. The naming had become inseparable from the tasting itself. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you taste without naming?" Sarah smiled gently. "I do not do anything special. I simply noticed one day that my words were not the same as my experience. The words come after, like an echo. The taste itself is there first, pure and direct. When I pay attention to what is there before the words arrive, everything becomes more vivid, more real." She lifted her cup again and took another sip, her face softening with simple pleasure. "Try it yourself. Before you name what you taste, notice that you have already tasted it. The knowing happens first. The naming comes second." Vin poured himself a cup from the same pot. He lifted it to his lips and tried to do what she described. It was difficult. His mind immediately began its familiar work of categorizing and comparing. But for a brief moment, just before the words arrived, he caught something. A flash of direct experience, taste without commentary, sensation without labels. It lasted only an instant before his expertise rushed back in. But in that instant, he understood what Sarah meant. There was something more immediate than all his knowledge, something that existed before the categories were applied. His 40 years of learning had given him many things, but they had also covered over the simplest thing of all, the direct experience that was there from the very beginning. "I tasted tea for the first time when I was a small boy," he said slowly. "I had no words for it then. I did not know good tea from poor tea, high mountain from low valley. I just tasted something warm and slightly bitter and strange. That tasting was complete in itself." Sarah nodded. "And that same tasting is still here now, beneath all your expertise. Your knowledge has not replaced it. It has only covered it over. The original face of your experience, the direct knowing before words, is still present. It has been present all along." After Sarah left, Vin sat alone in his tea house for a long time. He drank cup after cup, trying to find that moment before naming, trying to taste with the simplicity of a child who has no categories at all. It was not easy. 40 years of training could not be set aside in an afternoon. But something had changed. He now knew that his expertise, valuable as it was not the foundation of his experience. Something more direct lay beneath it. All his learning rested on a capacity for experience that existed before the learning began. That capacity was the original face of his tasting, and it had been with him since his first sip of tea as a small boy. Buddhism shows us that our concepts, useful as they are, create a kind of distance between us and direct experience. We learn to name and categorize the world, and these names become so familiar that we mistake them for the world itself. We think we are experiencing reality when we are often experiencing our ideas about reality. The Buddha taught that liberation involves seeing through this veil of concepts to what lies beneath. Not that concepts are bad or should be abandoned, but that they should be recognized for what they are. They are tools, maps, pointers. They are not the territory itself. Sierra showed Vin something precious. She showed him that, beneath his elaborate expertise, a simpler knowing remained. The ability to taste had preceded all his learning about taste. The direct experience had been there first, and it was still there now, waiting to be noticed beneath all the categories he had accumulated. The original face is like this. It is the direct awareness that exists before we learn to describe what we are aware of. It was present in our first moments of life, before we had any words at all. It remains present now, beneath all our knowledge and opinions, unchanged by everything we have learned. We do not need to abandon our knowledge to touch this deeper ground. We simply need to notice that it is there. Beneath the naming, there is experiencing. Beneath the knowing about, there is simply knowing. This is the original face of our awareness, and it has been with us all along. Let us explore another story that shows this teaching from a different perspective. In a village at the foot of a great mountain, there lived an old woodcarver named Bim who had practiced his craft for 60 years. His hands, though aged and spotted now, could still shape wood with remarkable precision. The figures he carved seemed almost alive, capturing something essential about the animals and people they portrayed. People often asked him how he achieved such lifelike results. He would always give the same answer, one that puzzled many who heard it. "I do not carve the figure," he would say. "I remove what is not the figure. The figure is already there, inside the wood. I just take away what hides it." Most people thought this was simply a humble way of describing his skill, but Bim meant it quite literally. When he looked at a piece of wood, he did not see raw material waiting to be shaped. He saw something already present, waiting to be revealed. His job was not to add or create, but to uncover what was already there. A young woodcarver named Pim came to study with him one summer. Pim was talented and eager, full of ideas for the figures he wanted to create. He had sketchbooks filled with designs, each more elaborate than the last. Bim looked through the sketchbooks with interest, but said nothing. Then he handed Pim a piece of wood and asked him to carve a bird. Pim set to work eagerly, consulting his sketches, planning out his approach, beginning to shape the wood according to his design. He worked for several hours, growing frustrated as the wood did not cooperate with his vision. The grain went the wrong way. Knots appeared where he did not want them. The more he tried to force his design onto the wood, the more the wood seemed to resist. Finally, he set down his tools in frustration. "The wood will not do what I want it to do." Bim picked up the piece and examined it thoughtfully. "You are trying to make the wood into something. But have you asked what it wants to become? Wood does not want anything. It is just wood." Bim smiled and set the piece down. "Come, let us walk." They walked together into the forest where Bim gathered his wood. The old man moved slowly among the fallen branches and weathered logs, touching some, passing others by, occasionally stopping to examine one more closely. "When I look for wood to carve," he explained, "I do not think about what I want to create. I look at each piece and try to see what is already there. This branch has a curve that suggests a leaping fish. That log has a knot that could become the eye of an owl. I do not impose my ideas. I discover what the wood has to offer. He picked up a small branch and turned it slowly in his hands. Before I learned any technique, before I knew anything about carving at all, I could see. That seeing was already complete. A child could look at this branch and notice its curve, its grain, its character. My years of training have given me the skill to reveal what I see, but the seeing itself was there from the beginning. Pim took the branch and looked at it, trying to see what Bim saw. At first, he could only see raw material, something to be shaped according to his will. But as he looked longer, letting go of his plans and designs, he began to notice the wood itself. The way it curved slightly, the pattern of the grain, the small bumps and irregularities that gave it character. "I think I see a snake," he said slowly. "The way it curves, and this texture at the end could be scales." Bim nodded approvingly. "Now you are looking with your original eyes, the eyes you had before you learned to impose your designs on things. The snake was there waiting. You did not create it. You simply noticed it." Pim returned to his piece of wood with new eyes. Instead of forcing his design onto the material, he looked more carefully at what was there. He noticed the grain, the shape, the natural tendencies of the piece. And slowly, a different figure began to emerge. Not the bird he had planned, but something that belonged to this particular piece of wood. It took him much longer than his usual work, but when he finished, he held something that surprised him. It was not as elaborate as his designs, not as impressive as what he had imagined, but it felt alive in a way his planned figures never did. It felt true. "You found your way back," Bim said, examining the finished piece. "All our training, all our technique, all our accumulated knowledge, it can help us or it can blind us. It helps us when we use it to reveal what is there. It blinds us when we use it to impose what we want." He set the carving down gently. "The original face is like this. It is not something we create or achieve. It is something we uncover by removing what obscures it. All our learning, all our accumulated identity is like wood shavings covering a figure that was always there. The work is not to add more, but to see what remains when the unnecessary is removed." Zen teaches us that our true nature is not something we construct through effort. It is not built from knowledge or created through practice. It is more like something we uncover, something we return to, something we recognize as having been present all along. The Buddha spoke of the mind's natural luminosity, its inherent clarity that exists before thoughts and concepts cloud it. This clarity is not achieved. It is revealed when the clouds part, when we stop adding and simply see what is there. Bim understood this through his craft. His skill was in removing what obscured, not in adding what was absent. The figure existed in the wood before he touched it. His years of training helped him reveal it, but they did not create it. The original face exists in each of us in the same way. Before all our learning, before all our accumulated identity, something was present that was complete in itself. All our knowledge and experience have piled on top of it, like wood shavings covering a carving. The work is not to add more to who we are, but to recognize what was there before the additions began. This is not about rejecting what we have learned or dismantling what we have built. It is simply about recognizing that beneath it all, something remains unchanged. The original face is not hidden. It is simply overlooked, covered by the very knowledge and identity we have worked so hard to accumulate. Let your breath soften now, and let your mind rest. Before you learned anything at all, awareness was here. It is here still, unchanged, quietly holding everything you have come to know. We often come to know ourselves through what we create, the work of our hands, the projects we complete, the things we bring into the world become mirrors in which we see our own reflection. When our creations succeed, we feel capable and worthy. When they fail or are lost, we can feel diminished, as if part of us has disappeared along with them. This is a natural way to move through life. We invest ourselves in what we do, and it makes sense that we would feel connected to the results. But Zen gently asks us to look more carefully at this connection. Are we truly what we produce? Or is there something more fundamental? A source from which all our creating flows. A river produces countless ripples and waves, but the river is not the ripples. It is what gives rise to them. A tree produces leaves and fruit, but the tree is not the leaves. It is what brings them forth, season after season, year after year. In the same way, we are not our creations. We are what creates. The original face is not found in the things we make or the work we accomplish. It is the presence from which all our doing emerges. When we understand this, we can hold our successes and failures more lightly. They matter, but they do not define the deepest truth of who we are. Tonight, we continue our exploration by looking at this relationship between who we are and what we produce. The creating is beautiful and meaningful, but something even more essential lies beneath it, unchanged by what it brings forth. Let us explore a story that shows how one woman came to understand this. In a valley known for its fertile soil, there lived a woman named Kara who attended the same garden for 30 years. What had begun as a small patch of vegetables behind her house had grown over the decades into something remarkable. Flowers bloomed in carefully planned sequences so that something was always in color. Fruit trees provided shade and sweetness. Herbs filled the air with fragrance. Visitors came from neighboring villages just to walk the winding paths and rest on the stone benches she had placed in quiet corners. Kara's garden had become her identity. When people spoke of her, they spoke of her garden. When she thought of herself, she thought of the beds she had shaped, the plants she had nurtured, the beauty she had coaxed from the earth. The garden was her life's work, and she could not imagine herself without it. She knew every plant by name, remembered when each one had been planted, could trace the history of the garden through the growth rings of its trees. On summer evenings, she would walk the paths slowly, touching leaves and checking soil, feeling a deep satisfaction in what she had created. This was her contribution to the world, her mark upon the earth, her proof that she had lived and worked and mattered. One spring, after a winter of unusually heavy rains, the river that ran along the edge of her property swelled beyond its banks. Kara woke one morning to find muddy water covering half her garden. She worked frantically to save what she could, but the flood was relentless. By the time the waters finally receded 3 days later, most of what she had spent 30 years building was destroyed. The flower beds were buried under silt. The fruit trees stood in pools of standing water, their roots drowning. The herbs had been washed away entirely, leaving only bare mud where fragrant plants had grown. Even the stone paths were covered and displaced, the careful design erased as if it had never existed. Kara walked through the devastation in a kind of daze. She could not process what she was seeing. This was not possible. This could not be happening. Her garden, her beautiful garden, the work of her lifetime, was gone. She found herself standing in what had been the heart of the garden, where a wooden bench had once sat beneath a flowering plum tree. The bench was overturned and half buried. The tree was still standing, but its blossoms had been stripped away by the flood, and its lower branches were caked with drying mud. Kara sat down on the muddy ground, unable to stand any longer. She felt erased. If her garden was gone, what was left of her? She had poured herself into this place for 30 years. Without it, she did not know who she was. She sat there for a long time as the morning passed into afternoon. She did not cry. She did not move. She simply sat with a hollowness that felt absolute. In the late afternoon, she heard footsteps approaching through the mud. Her neighbor, an old man named Deshi who had lived beside her for many years, picked his way carefully through the debris. He was carrying 2 cups of tea. He did not speak at first. He simply handed her one of the cups and lowered himself slowly onto the overturned bench, not seeming to mind the mud. They sat together in silence for a while, looking at the ruined garden. "I remember when you first started this garden," Deshi said finally. "You were young then, full of energy and plans. You told me you were going to create something beautiful." Kara nodded but did not speak. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else. "And you did create something beautiful," he continued. "Something that brought joy to many people, including me. I loved walking here in the evenings. I loved watching it change with the seasons." "It is gone now," Kara said, her voice flat. 30 years of work. Gone in 3 days. Deshi was quiet for a moment, sipping his tea. Then he said something that cut through her numbness. "The garden came from you. You did not come from the garden." Kara looked at him, not understanding. "You are sitting here feeling like you have been erased," he said gently. "Like when the garden disappeared, you disappeared too. But think about this. Where did the garden come from? It came from your hands, your vision, your care. It came from something inside you that knew how to create beauty. That something is still here. It did not wash away with the flowers." He gestured at the muddy ruin around them. "This will grow again. Not the same garden perhaps, but something will grow. Because what created this garden is still present. It is sitting right here, drinking tea with me." Kara felt something shift in her chest, a small crack in the numbness. She looked at her hands, mud-caked and trembling. These hands had planted every seed, pruned every branch, shaped every path. They could do it again. Not because the garden needed to be restored, but because the ability to create had not been lost. "I thought I was the garden," she said slowly. "I thought without it, I was nothing." "Many people make this mistake," Deshi replied. "They pour themselves into their work and then believe they are the work. But the work is like a river flowing from a spring. The river can dry up, can change course, can disappear entirely. But the spring remains. You are the spring, Kara. not the river. Over the following months, Kara did begin to rebuild. Not frantically, not desperately, but slowly and thoughtfully. She found that the loss had changed her relationship with the garden. She still loved the work, still found joy in watching things grow. But she no longer confused herself with what she produced. She knew now that she was something more than her creations, something that would remain even if everything she built washed away again. Zen teaches us that our creations are expressions of who we are, not definitions of who we are. We flow into our work like water into a vessel, but we are not the vessel. We are the water that can take any shape, fill any container, flow in any direction. The Buddha spoke of attachment as a source of suffering, and one of our deepest attachments is to the fruits of our labor. We work hard. We create something meaningful, and then we cling to it as if our very existence depends on its survival. When it is lost or damaged or destroyed, we suffer as if we ourselves have been harmed. But the original face is not found in what we produce. It is the presence that produces, the awareness that creates, the source from which all our doing emerges. This source is not diminished when its creations fail. It is not enhanced when they succeed. It simply is, constant and unchanging, ready to create again whenever the moment calls for it. Kara discovered this truth in the mud of her ruined garden. She discovered that she was not the flowers or the paths or the carefully tended beds. She was what had brought them into being, and that capacity remained untouched by the flood. The original face is like this. It is not our achievements or our failures, our successes or our losses. It is what witnesses them all and remains unchanged. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a region where temples dotted the mountainsides, there lived a bell maker named Bo, who had cast bronze bells for 50 years. His bells hung in temples throughout the province, calling monks to meditation, marking the hours, filling the valleys with their deep, resonant voices. Bo had developed an extraordinary ear over the decades. He could hear subtle imperfections that others missed entirely. He knew exactly how much bronze to use, how long to heat it, how to shape the mold so that the finished bell would sing with perfect clarity. Each bell he created carried something of his essence, some quality of attention and care that could be heard in every note. He often said that his bells were his children, and in many ways they were. He had given birth to them through fire and skill and patient labor. When he heard one of his bells ringing in a distant temple, he felt a deep satisfaction, as if part of him had found a home in that sacred sound. But in his 70th year, Bo began to notice something troubling. The high tones of the bells were becoming harder to hear. At first, he thought it was just fatigue, but the problem grew worse over the months. By the following year, he could no longer hear the subtle overtones that had always guided his work. His hearing was failing. The sense that had defined his craft, that had made his bells exceptional, was slowly disappearing. Bo fell into a deep sadness. He still went to his workshop each day, but the joy had gone out of the work. He could no longer trust his own ears. He could no longer know if a bell was perfect or flawed. The thing that made him who he was seemed to be leaving him, note by note, tone by tone. One afternoon, a monk named Suro, who had known Bo for many years, came to visit. Suro was old himself, his face weathered by decades of practice and contemplation. He found Bo sitting in his workshop, staring at a half-finished bell with empty eyes. "I heard about your ears," Suro said, settling onto a stool across from the bellmaker. "I am sorry." Bo shook his head. "It is more than my ears. It is everything. My whole life has been about sound, about hearing what others cannot hear, about giving voice to bronze. Without my hearing, what am I?" Suro was quiet for a moment, looking at the bell that hung between them. "May I tell you something I have observed over the years?" Bo nodded. "I have heard many bells in my lifetime. I have meditated to the sound of bells from many different makers. Yours have always been different. Not just in their sound, though that is beautiful. There is something else in them, something I can feel even when the sound has faded. A quality of presence, of care, of attention." He reached out and touched the bronze surface of the unfinished bell. "This quality did not come from your ears alone. It came from something deeper. Your ears were tools that served something more essential. That something is still here, even if the tools are failing." Bo shook his head again. "You do not understand. The sound is everything. Without being able to hear it perfectly, I cannot know if the bell is right." "Perhaps," Suro acknowledged. "Perhaps your bells will be different now. Perhaps they will no longer be perfect in the way they were before. But let me ask you this. Before you learned to hear so precisely, before you developed your remarkable ear, what was it that drew you to this work?" Bo thought back to his youth, to the first time he had watched a bell being cast. He remembered the heat of the forge, the glow of the molten bronze, the moment when the mold was broken and the bell emerged. He remembered striking it for the first time and feeling something move in his chest. "I loved the way they rang," he said slowly. "Even before I could hear all the subtleties, I loved the sound. It felt like the voice of something sacred. And that love, that sense of the sacred, did it come from your ears?" Bo was silent. The love had come from somewhere deeper than his hearing. It had come from a place that recognized beauty before he had words for it, that felt the sacred before he could analyze it. "Your ears gave you the ability to refine your bells," Suro said gently. "They let you hear flaws and correct them. This was a great gift, and its loss is worth grieving. But the source of your work was never your ears. It was whatever recognized the sacred in that first ringing sound. It was the presence that poured itself into each bell with love and attention. That presence has not gone deaf. It is still here, listening in a way that goes beyond sound." Bo sat with these words for a long time after Suro left. He thought about all the bells he had made, all the sounds he had shaped over 50 years. They had mattered to him so much, had felt like extensions of himself. But Suro was right. The bells expressed something that existed before them. His love of the sacred, his dedication to beauty, his patient attention, these had not come from his ears. They had flowed through his ears into the bronze, but their source was somewhere else entirely. He returned to his work the following week. His bells were different now. He could no longer hear all the subtleties, and he knew they were not as refined as before. But he found that something else came through in their sound, something simpler and perhaps more honest. When he struck them, he listened not with his failing ears, but with that deeper place that had first recognized the sacred in bronze song. Years later, monks would say that Bo's late bells had a different quality than his earlier work. They were not as technically perfect, but there was something in them that touched people more directly. A quality of presence, they said, as if the bell maker had finally let go of everything except what mattered most. Buddhism shows us that our skills and abilities are gifts we use for a time, but they are not who we truly are. They are tools in service of something deeper, expressions of a presence that exists before and beyond them. The Buddha taught that everything conditioned is impermanent, including our capacities and talents. The eyes that see clearly today will dim. The hands that work skillfully will tremble. The ears that hear precisely will grow dull. If we believe we are these abilities, we will suffer as they fade. But if we recognize them as instruments of something deeper, we can let them change without losing ourselves. Bo discovered that his identity had never truly resided in his ears. His hearing had served the original face, not the other way around. When the hearing faded, what remained was the presence that had always been the true source of his work. This presence continued to create, continued to love the sacred, continued to pour itself into bronze. It simply did so through different means. The original face is not our talents or abilities. It is not our skills or achievements. It is what uses these tools, what expresses itself through them, what remains when they are taken away. When we understand this, we can hold our gifts more lightly, grateful for their service but not dependent on them for our sense of self. Let us explore one more story that shows this teaching from another perspective. In a coastal village where fishing boats set out each dawn, there lived a net maker named Kai, who had spent 40 years weaving the nets that kept the village fed. His hands knew every knot, every pattern, every way of turning cord into something that could hold the slippery abundance of the sea. Kai's nets were prized throughout the region. Fishermen said they caught more with his nets than with any others. Something about the way he wove them made them stronger, more supple, more able to hold what they gathered without tearing or tangling. When people asked his secret, Kai would just shrug. He did not think of it as a secret. He simply paid attention to each knot as he tied it. He let his hands do what they knew how to do. He did not rush or force anything. The nets emerged from this attention, knot by knot, row by row, until they were complete. One evening, a young woman named Yori came to him with a request. She wanted to learn net making, she said. Her father was a fisherman, and she wanted to contribute to his work. But more than that, she was drawn to the craft itself. She had watched Kai work and felt something stirring in her, a recognition that this was something she wanted to understand. Kai agreed to teach her, and they began meeting each afternoon in his small workshop near the harbor. He showed her the basic knots, the patterns, the way to hold the cord so it flowed easily through her fingers. Yori learned quickly. Within a few weeks, she could make a simple net that held together properly. But she was not satisfied. Her nets worked, but they lacked something. They did not have the quality that made Kai's nets special. They were functional but not alive. "What am I missing?" she asked one day, frustrated after completing a net that looked correct but felt somehow empty. Kai examined her work carefully. The knots were tied correctly. The pattern was right. There was nothing technically wrong with it, and yet he understood what she meant. Something was absent. "Your hands know what to do," he said. "You have learned the skill, but your hands are working alone. They are not connected to anything deeper. What do you mean? Kai set down the net and looked at her directly. When I weave, I am not thinking about nets. I am not even thinking about knots. I am simply present, here, with the cord in my hands. The weaving happens through me, not by me. It is hard to explain. He picked up a length of cord and began to weave, his hands moving in the familiar patterns. Watch my hands, but do not watch only my hands. Watch my eyes. Watch my breathing. Watch all of me. Yuri watched. She saw his hands moving with practiced ease, but she also saw something else. A stillness behind the movement. A presence that seemed to include the cord, the knots, the emerging net, and Kai himself, all as one thing. He was not making a net. He was participating in something that included him. What you are seeing is not a technique, Kai said as he worked. It cannot be taught the way I taught you the knots. It is more like remembering something you already know. Before you learned any craft at all, before you knew how to do anything useful, you were already present. That presence is still here. When you weave from that place, the net has life. When you weave from your hands alone, it is just cord. Yuri returned to her work with new attention. She tried to find the presence Kai had pointed to, the awareness that existed before her skills. It was difficult. Her mind kept jumping to the technique, evaluating each knot, comparing her work to his. But slowly, in small glimpses, she began to sense what he meant. There were moments when she forgot about making a net and simply moved with the cord, present and attentive, not trying to achieve anything. In those moments, something shifted. The work became easier, more natural, more alive. And when she looked at what she had made during those moments, she could see the difference. The knots were the same, but something else had been woven in along with them. You are beginning to find it, Kai said when she showed him her latest work. The skill gives you the means, but the presence gives the skill its life. Never forget which one is the source. Zen teaches us that our creations carry the quality of the awareness from which they emerge. When we work from a place of presence, that presence flows into what we make. When we work from mere technique, we produce things that are correct, but somehow lifeless. The original face is this presence that exists before any skill is learned. It is what gives life to everything we do, what makes our creations more than just products of effort. Skills can be taught and learned, but the presence from which meaningful work emerges is something we already possess. It does not need to be acquired. It simply needs to be recognized and allowed to participate in what we do. We are not our skills, though we express ourselves through them. We are not our products, though we bring them into being. We are the awareness that employs the skills and creates the products, the presence that was here before we learned anything, and remains here still, unchanged by what it has accomplished or failed to accomplish. Let your body settle now, heavy and at ease. Whatever you have created, whatever you have lost, something in you remains untouched. Rest in that for a moment and let your breathing be soft. Everything about us changes. The body we inhabit today is not the body we had as children. The thoughts that fill our minds now are different from those we thought last year or last decade. Our feelings rise and fall like weather, sunny one moment, clouded the next. Even our personalities shift over time, shaped by experience and circumstance. We look at old images of ourselves and barely recognize the person looking back. We remember beliefs we once held firmly and wonder how we ever thought such things. The self that existed 10 years ago feels almost like a stranger, connected to us, but somehow distant and unfamiliar. And yet, despite all this change, something feels continuous. There is a thread that runs through all the different versions of ourselves, a sense that the one who was a child is somehow the same one who is here now. We cannot quite name it or point to it, but we feel its presence. It is what makes our memories feel like our memories, what makes our life feel like one life rather than a series of disconnected moments. Zen invites us to look carefully at this sense of continuity. What is it that remains unchanged while everything else transforms? What is the still point at the center of all this movement? The original face is not any of the things that change. It is not the body, which ages and alters. It is not the thoughts, which come and go endlessly. It is not the feelings, which shift with circumstance. It is the awareness that witnesses all these changes, the silent presence that has been here through every phase of our lives. Tonight, we continue our exploration by looking at this unchanging center, not as an idea to understand, but as something to notice in our own experience. It has been with us since our first breath. It is with us still. Let us explore a story that shows how one woman glimpsed this truth. In a house at the edge of a quiet town, there lived a woman named Yuki who had kept a journal every day for 60 years. She had started as a young woman, just married, full of hopes and uncertainties about the life ahead. Each night before sleep, she would write a few lines about her day, her thoughts, her feelings. The habit had never broken. Now the journals filled an entire room. Dozens of cloth-bound books lined the shelves, each one containing a year of her life in careful handwriting. The earliest volumes were written in the bold strokes of youth. The later ones showed the gradually changing hand of age. Together, they formed a record of one human life, day by day, decade by decade. Yuki's daughter, Michi, had always been curious about these journals. She knew they existed, but had never read them, respecting her mother's privacy. But one winter, when Yuki fell ill and could not leave her bed for several weeks, she asked Michi to bring her some of the old volumes. She wanted to revisit certain times in her life, she said. She wanted to remember. Michi carried armfuls of journals to her mother's bedside. Over the following days, as Yuki rested and recovered, they began to read through them together. Michi would read aloud while her mother listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes growing quiet, sometimes shaking her head at what her younger self had written. They read about Yuki as a newlywed, nervous and excited, learning to share her life with another person. They read about the birth of Michi herself, the sleepless nights, the overwhelming love, the exhaustion and joy tangled together. They read about difficult years when money was scarce and worry was constant. They read about seasons of contentment, of loss, of unexpected happiness. Michi found herself moved by these glimpses of her mother's inner life. She had known the events, more or less, but she had never known the private thoughts and feelings that accompanied them. Here was her mother as a complete person, not just a parent, but a woman who had doubted and hoped and struggled and grown. Some passages made Michi laugh. Her mother's worries about small things, her excitement over moments that seemed ordinary now, her passionate opinions that had softened over time. Other passages brought tears. The raw grief after Michi's father died. The fear during a year when illness had threatened to take Michi herself as a child. The quiet loneliness of certain seasons that Michi had never known about. Through it all, she began to see something remarkable. The voice in the journals changed over the decades. The young bride wrote differently than the middle-aged mother, who wrote differently than the widow, who wrote differently than the elderly woman resting beside her now. The handwriting changed, the concerns changed, the tone changed. And yet there was an unmistakable continuity, a thread that ran through all the different voices, connecting them into one life. One afternoon, after reading a particularly emotional passage from 40 years earlier, Michi set down the journal and looked at her mother. "Which one of these is really you?" she asked. The hopeful young bride, the exhausted mother, the grieving widow? You seem like so many different people in these pages. Yuki was quiet for a long moment, looking at the stack of journals on the table beside her bed. Her life, written down. So many versions of herself, preserved in ink. "I have wondered the same thing," she said finally. "When I read these old entries, I barely recognize myself sometimes. The woman who wrote this 40 years ago, she felt things I no longer feel, believed things I no longer believe. And yet I know she was me. There is a thread connecting us, even though almost everything else has changed." She reached out and touched one of the journals, her aged hand resting on the worn cloth cover. "The one asking the question is closer to me than any of those pages. I wrote all of them. I lived all those seasons. But what watched them pass has not been captured in any book." Michi considered this. "You mean there is something that stayed the same while everything else changed?" "Yes. Something that was there when I was a young bride, writing nervously about my new life. The same something was there when I held you as a baby, when I sat beside your father as he died, when I wrote this morning about the snow outside my window. Everything else shifted and transformed. But there was always someone watching, someone experiencing, someone aware of what was happening. That someone has not aged the way my body has aged. It has not changed the way my thoughts and feelings have changed." She smiled gently. "When I read these old journals, I am not reading about a stranger. I am reading about what happened to this awareness, this presence, over the course of a lifetime. The presence itself is still here, unchanged. Only the experiences have been different." Michi looked at her mother with new eyes. She had always seen the external changes, the graying hair, the lined face, the slower movements. But now she caught a glimpse of something else, something looking out from behind her mother's eyes that was not old at all. It was simply present, awake, the same presence that had looked out from the eyes of the young bride 60 years ago. "Is that what you mean by remembering?" Michi asked. "Not just the events, but this thread that connects them all, perhaps. When I asked you to bring me these journals, I thought I wanted to remember the past. But what I really wanted, I think, was to feel that continuity again. To remind myself that despite all the changes, something has remained. Something that makes all these different selves one life." Yuki closed her eyes, tired from the conversation but peaceful. The journals captured the waves. But the ocean that held them all, that does not fit in any book. It has been here all along, holding every wave, unchanged by any of them. Zen teaches us that we are not the passing contents of our experience. Thoughts come and go, feelings rise and fall, even our sense of who we are shifts over time. But there is something that witnesses all this movement, a still point that does not move with what it sees. The Buddha spoke of consciousness as something that exists prior to its objects. Before a thought arises, awareness is present to receive it. Before a feeling emerges, something is there to feel it. This prior awareness is not itself a thought or a feeling. It is the space in which thoughts and feelings appear and disappear. Yuki discovered this through her journals. Reading through 60 years of her life, she saw how much had changed, how many different selves she had been. But she also sensed the thread that connected them all, the awareness that had witnessed every phase without being any particular phase. This awareness was closer to her original face than any of the experiences it had witnessed. We can notice this in our own lives. The person who was a child, full of wonder and confusion, was somehow the same one who is here now. Not the same body, not the same thoughts, not the same feelings, but the same awareness, the same presence, looking out at the world through different eyes at different times. This continuity points towards something that does not change even as everything else transforms around it. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a temple surrounded by ancient cedar trees, there lived a gardener named Oso who had tended the same grounds for 50 years. He had arrived as a young man seeking work and had never left. The temple had become his home, and its gardens had become his life's purpose. Over the decades, he had watched the gardens change with the seasons and the years. He had seen young trees grow tall and old trees fall. He had witnessed storms that reshaped whole sections overnight and slow transformations that took decades to unfold. He knew every corner of the grounds, every stone, every path, every view. One spring, a young apprentice named Tomo came to learn the art of temple gardening. He was eager and curious, full of questions about plants and soil and design. Oso took him on as a student, teaching him the practical skills of the work. Tomo reminded Oso of himself at that age, though he would never have said so aloud. The same impatience, the same desire to understand everything at once, the same barely concealed ambition to create something remarkable. Oso watched the young man with a mixture of fondness and amusement, knowing that the years would teach him what words could not. As they worked together through the seasons, Tomo often asked Oso about the past. What had the garden looked like before? How had it changed over the years? What was the same now as it had been 50 years ago? Oso would answer these questions with stories. He remembered when the great pine near the eastern gate was just a sapling. He remembered when the pond had been dug and filled. He remembered seasons of drought and seasons of flood, winters that killed tender plants, and summers that brought unexpected blooms. One autumn afternoon, as they raked fallen leaves together, Tomo asked a different kind of question. "Master Oso, you have changed so much since you first came here. You were young then, and now you are old. Have you changed as much as the garden?" Oso paused in his raking and looked around at the grounds he knew so well. The maples were brilliant red and orange, dropping their leaves in the soft wind. The cedars stood unchanged as always, dark green against the autumn colors. "My hair has changed," he said slowly. "It was black once, and now it is white. My strength has changed. I could work all day without rest, and now I must pace myself carefully. my thoughts have changed too. The young man who came here was full of ambition and impatience. He is gone now. He resumed raking, the leaves gathering in neat piles. But there is something that has not changed. Something that watched the young man work and watches this old man work. I cannot describe it exactly, but I know it is there. The seasons pass through it like wind through an open window. It sees the changes but does not change with them. Tomo stopped raking and looked at his teacher. How do you know it has not changed? Oso considered this. When I remember myself as a young man, I am not remembering a stranger. There is a recognition, a continuity. The one who is remembering is somehow the same one who lived those memories. If everything had changed completely, there would be no connection. The past would belong to someone else entirely. He leaned on his rake and looked up at the cedars. These trees are different every year. They grow new needles. They drop old ones. Their branches reach higher. But there is something about a cedar that remains cedar. Year after year, century after century. Something essential that does not change even as the tree transforms. And we are like the trees? In a way, we grow and change and age. But there is something in us that remains. Something that was there in our first moments and will be there in our last. I cannot point to it or describe it, but after 50 years in this garden, I have come to trust it. It is more truly me than my hair or my strength or my thoughts. Those are like the leaves that change color and fall. But there is something that watches the leaves fall season after season, and that something does not fall with them. Tomo returned to his raking, but the conversation stayed with him. Over the following years, as he learned the ways of the garden, he also began to notice what Oso had described. The changes were constant, in the garden and in himself. But there was something steady beneath the changes, a quiet awareness that witnessed the seasons without being swept away by them. When Oso finally passed away, many years later, Tomo was the one who tended his grave in a quiet corner of the garden. He remembered their conversation about change and continuity, about the something that remains while everything else transforms. He understood now what Oso had meant. The old gardener's body had returned to the earth, but the awareness that had looked out from his eyes, that had witnessed 50 years of seasons, that was something else entirely. It did not belong to the grave. Buddhism shows us that impermanence is the nature of all conditioned things. Bodies age, thoughts pass, feelings fade. Nothing that can be seen or touched or measured remains the same for long. This is not a tragedy, but simply the way things are, the endless flow of arising and passing that characterizes all experience. But the Buddha also pointed towards something that witnesses this flow without being carried away by it. Awareness itself does not age the way the body ages. It does not come and go the way thoughts and feelings come and go. It is more like the sky through which clouds pass, unchanged by the weather it holds. The original face is this unchanging awareness. It was present when we were children, looking out at a world full of mystery. It is present now, looking out at a world we think we understand. It will be present tomorrow, whatever that brings. The contents of experience keep changing, but the awareness that holds them remains the same. Oso understood this through his years in the garden. He watched everything change, including himself, and yet he sensed something that did not change with all the rest. This was not a comforting belief or a philosophical idea. It was something he noticed directly, something he came to trust through decades of careful attention. Let us explore one more story that shows this teaching from another perspective. In a village beside a wide, slow river, there lived a woman named Mina who had worked as a ferry operator for 30 years. Each day, she rowed passengers across the water, from one side to the other, back and forth, from dawn until dusk. The river was always moving. Its currents shifted with the seasons, faster in spring when the snow melted, slower in the dry months of summer. Its color changed too, brown after heavy rains, clear and green in the calm periods. Some days it was smooth as glass, and other days the wind raised waves that made the crossing difficult. Mina knew the river in all its moods. She had learned to read its surface, to anticipate its currents, to work with its power rather than against it. Over 30 years, she had come to love its constant change, the way it was never quite the same 2 days in a row. One afternoon, a traveler boarded her ferry for the crossing. He was a middle-aged man with the look of someone who had been walking for many days. His clothes were dusty from the road, and there was a heaviness in his expression that suggested he carried more than just the pack on his back. As Mina rowed them across, he watched the water flowing past with great attention, as if searching for something in its movement. "This river," he said. "It is never the same, is it? The water we are floating on right now has never been here before and will never be here again." "That is true," Mina agreed. "I have been crossing this river for 30 years, and I have never crossed the same river twice. Every crossing is new, even though I have made this journey 10,000 times." The traveler nodded thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about change lately. How nothing stays the same, how everything passes. I lost my wife last winter, and since then I have been walking, trying to understand what remains when someone we love disappears. It makes me wonder what is real, if everything is constantly disappearing." Mina let the oars rest for a moment, allowing the ferry to drift with the current. She understood this kind of grief, this searching. She had felt it herself at different times in her life. "May I tell you what I have noticed after 30 years on this water? Please. The river is always changing, as you say. But there is also something that does not change. The riverbed, the banks, the shape of the valley that holds the water. The water flows through, but the river remains. Not the same water, but the same river." She took up the oars again and resumed rowing. "I think we are like that. So much of us changes. Our bodies, our thoughts, our feelings. These are like the water, always flowing, never the same. But there is something like the riverbed in us too. Something that holds the flow. Something that the changes pass through without changing." The traveler was quiet for a while, watching the water stream past the hull of the ferry. "How do you know this riverbed exists in us? How do you experience it?" Mina thought carefully before answering. "When I remember myself as a young woman first learning to row, I recognize her. She is me, somehow, even though everything about her has changed. The body is different, the thoughts are different, the feelings are different. But the one who is remembering is the same one who lived those memories. That sameness is not any of the things that changed. It is something else, something that held all those changes the way the riverbed holds the water." "And you have found this comforting?" "I have found it true. Whether it is comforting depends on the day. She smiled slightly. But it has changed how I see things. I no longer identify so strongly with the water. I used to think I was my body, my thoughts, my feelings. Now I see those as what flows through me, not what I am. What I am is more like the riverbed, quiet and still, holding whatever flows past. She paused, thinking of how to say what she had learned over so many crossings. When you lost your wife, much was lost. The water that was her life flowed away and cannot return. This is the truth of change, and it is painful. But the love you felt for her, the awareness that held your life together, that is not water. That is riverbed. It remains, even when the water changes. They reached the far bank, and the traveler stepped off the ferry. He paused before continuing his journey and looked back at Mina. "Thank you," he said. "I came looking for a way across the water. I think I found something more." Mina nodded and turned the ferry back toward the other shore. The river flowed around her, endless and always changing. But she sat at the center of the movement, rowing steadily, holding her place in the current. She had found something that did not need to fight the flow, that could rest in the midst of constant change. It was not the water. It was what the water moved through. Zen teaches us that our true nature is not found in the stream of experience, but in what holds the stream. We are not the passing thoughts, the changing feelings, the aging body. We are more like the space through which these pass, the awareness that contains them without being contained by them. The Buddha pointed to this again and again in his teachings. He asked his students to notice what was present before thought, to find the awareness that existed before any particular experience arose. This awareness is not another object to be seen. It is what sees. It is not another experience to be had. It is what experiences. The original face is this still center in the midst of all movement. It was present in our first moments of life, before we had any experiences at all. It remains present now, holding whatever arises. It will be present in our final moments, unchanged by all that has passed through it. We cannot see it the way we see other things, because it is what does the seeing. We cannot think it the way we think other thoughts, because it is what does the thinking. But we can notice it, sense it, recognize it as the continuous thread that runs through all our changing experiences. This recognition is the beginning of knowing our original face. Let your breath deepen now, slow and gentle. Through all the changes of your life, something has remained. It is here now, quiet and steady, holding this moment just as it has held every moment. Rest in that stillness for a breath or two. We all carry a story about who we are. It begins before we can remember and grows with each passing year. This happened to me, we say. I came from here. I suffered this loss, celebrated this victory, made this mistake, learned this lesson. The story becomes so familiar that we mistake it for ourselves. We believe we are the narrative we have constructed, the tale we tell about our lives. These stories serve an important purpose. They help us make sense of our experiences, connect with others, and understand our place in the world. Without some sense of our own history, we would be lost in each moment, unable to learn from the past or plan for the future. But Zen gently invites us to notice something important. Before any story began, something was already present. Before the first chapter was written, before the first event occurred that would become part of our narrative, we were already here. The one who would live the story existed before the story started. The original face is not found in our stories. It is what was present before there was anything to tell. It is the blank page before the first word was written, the silence before the first sound was made. Our stories are written upon it, but they do not create it. They express it, perhaps, but they do not define it. Tonight, we continue our exploration by looking at this relationship between who we are and the stories we tell about ourselves. The stories are meaningful and important, but they rest upon something that has no story at all. Let us explore a tale that shows how one woman began to see beyond her narrative. In a village surrounded by rice fields, there lived a woman named Pari who carried a heavy burden. 30 years ago, when she was young and thoughtless, she had done something that caused great harm to someone she loved. The details of what happened are not important. What matters is that the weight of it had never left her. She had apologized, of course, many times over the years. She had tried to make amends in whatever way she could. The person she had harmed had eventually forgiven her, had told her to let it go and move on. But Pari could not forgive herself. The story of what she had done had become the defining chapter of her life, the lens through which she saw everything else. When she looked in the mirror, she saw someone who had caused harm. When she met new people, she wondered if they could sense the darkness in her past. When good things happened to her, she felt she did not deserve them. The story of her mistake had become her identity, a weight she carried every moment of every day. She had tried to escape it in various ways over the years. She had moved to different villages, hoping distance would help. She had thrown herself into work, hoping busyness would quiet the voice in her head. She had even visited healers and wise people, hoping someone could lift the burden from her shoulders. Nothing had worked. The story remained as heavy as ever. One autumn, she heard about an elderly monk named Gensho who lived in a small hermitage in the hills above the village. People said he had a way of helping those who were stuck, though no one could quite explain how. Some said he asked questions that changed how you saw things. Others said he simply listened in a way that made burdens lighter. Pari decided to visit him, though she held little hope that he could help where so many others had failed. The path to the hermitage wound through bamboo groves and across small streams. Pari walked slowly, half hoping she would lose her way and have an excuse to turn back. But the path was clear, and by midday she had arrived. The hermitage was a simple hut with a thatched roof, surrounded by wild plants and birdsong. Gensho was sitting outside when she arrived, mending a torn robe with careful stitches. He looked up as she approached and gestured for her to sit on a flat stone nearby. "You look tired," he said simply. "I am tired," Pari admitted. "I have been tired for 30 years. Tell me." And so she told him her story. The whole thing, from beginning to end, leaving nothing out. She told him what she had done, how it had harmed someone, how the guilt had followed her ever since. She told him about the apologies and the forgiveness that she could not accept. She told him how the story had become a prison she could not escape. Gensho listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, continuing his mending as if he had all the time in the world. "This story you carry," he said finally. "It is very heavy." "Yes." and it has shaped everything about how you see yourself. Yes, I am the one who did this terrible thing. That is who I am. Gensho set down his mending and looked at her directly. Tell me about the morning before it happened. The morning of that day, before anything had gone wrong. Who were you then? Pari was confused by the question. I do not understand. You woke up that morning, yes? You opened your eyes, you breathed, you began your day. At that moment, before the events of the day unfolded, who were you? Were you already the person who carries this weight? Pari thought back, trying to remember that distant morning. She had woken in her small room, she recalled, with sunlight coming through the window. She had felt ordinary, unremarkable. She had no idea what the day would bring. She was just herself, moving into another day. I was just me, she said slowly. I did not know what was going to happen. I was not yet the person who had done this thing. And the day before that, and the week before, and the year before, all those days when you were simply yourself, before this story began, Pari felt something shifting in her chest, a loosening she had not expected. She had been so focused on the story of her mistake that she had forgotten there was ever a time before it. She had existed for years before that day, had been a complete person, had lived and breathed and experienced the world. That person had not been defined by what was to come. I was whole then, she said quietly. Before the story began, I was whole. And what happened to that wholeness? Did the events of that day destroy it? I thought they did. I thought they changed me forever, made me into something damaged. Gensho picked up his mending again, his fingers moving with patient skill. The events of that day added a chapter to your story. A painful chapter, one that brought suffering to you and to another. I do not dismiss that suffering, but I want you to see something important. The one who lived that chapter was there before the chapter began. She was there after it ended. She is here now, sitting with me, still whole beneath all the stories she carries. Pari felt tears beginning to fall, the first tears she had allowed herself in years. But I did this thing. It happened. It is part of who I am. It is part of your story, yes. But are you your story? Or are you the one to whom the story happened? Gensho paused, letting the question settle. Before there was anything to tell about you, you were already here. Before the first event of your life, you existed. That existence was complete in itself, needing no story to justify it. The stories came later, piling up year after year. But they were written upon something that was already present. That something is still here. It has never been damaged by any story, no matter how painful. Pari sat with this for a long time as the afternoon shadows lengthened around them. She thought about all the years she had spent identified with her mistake, believing that single chapter was the whole book. She had forgotten that she existed before the chapter began. She had forgotten that the one who made the mistake was more than the mistake itself. How do I find my way back to that? She asked. To the wholeness that was there before? You do not need to find your way back. You never left. You have simply been so focused on one chapter that you forgot the rest of the book. And more than that, you forgot the one who is reading the book, the awareness that holds all the chapters without being any particular chapter. He tied off the last stitch in his robe and held it up to examine his work. Your story is not who you are. It is something that happened to who you are. The original face was present before your story began, and it remains present now. It has witnessed every chapter, including the painful ones, without being defined by any of them. Pari did not leave the hermitage that day with her burden completely lifted. 30 years of carrying a story could not be undone in a single conversation. But something had cracked open in her. She had glimpsed the possibility that she was more than her worst moment, more than her most painful chapter. There was ground beneath her story, and that ground was not damaged by anything written upon it. Zen teaches us that our stories, no matter how true, are not the final word about who we are. We live through events, we suffer and celebrate, we make mistakes and sometimes find redemption. All of this becomes the narrative of our lives, the tale we tell ourselves and others about who we are and how we came to be. But the Buddha pointed to something beneath all narratives. Before any story begins, awareness is present. Before the first word is written, the page exists. Our stories are important, but they are written upon something that has no story of its own. This blank page, this silent awareness, is closer to our original face than any chapter we have lived. Pari had spent 30 years believing she was her mistake. She had collapsed her entire identity into a single painful chapter. What Gensho helped her see was that the chapter, painful as it was, did not erase what was there before it began. The wholeness she remembered from before the story started had never actually disappeared. It had simply been obscured by her focus on the narrative. We can notice this in our own experience. Our stories feel so solid, so defining. But there was a time before each story began, a time when we simply existed without that particular narrative. And there will be a time after each story has become just a memory. What remains through all this is not another story. It is the presence in which stories arise and pass away. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a town known for its scholars and scribes, there lived a historian named Tam who had devoted his life to preserving the stories of his people. For 40 years, he had collected tales from the elderly, transcribed documents from crumbling archives, and written detailed accounts of events that might otherwise be forgotten. His work filled an entire building, shelves upon shelves of carefully recorded history. Tam believed deeply in the importance of stories. Stories were how people understood themselves, he often said. Without stories, we would be lost, disconnected from our past, unable to make sense of our present. He had built his entire life around this belief, sacrificing comfort and ease to ensure that the stories of his community would survive. One dry summer, a fire broke out in the building where Tam kept his life's work. The flames spread quickly through the old wooden structure, feeding on decades of dry paper and parchment. Villagers came running with buckets of water, but the fire was already too strong. By the time the flames were controlled, most of his collection had been destroyed. 40 years of careful preservation, thousands of stories gathered and recorded, all reduced to ash and smoke. Tam stood in the ruins as the sun set, unable to move or speak. The smell of burned paper hung in the air. Fragments of pages, their edges blackened and curled, drifted in the evening breeze. Everything he had worked for was gone. The stories he had devoted his life to saving had vanished in a single afternoon. He felt as if he himself had burned along with them, as if his very existence had been called into question. A young student named Lun found him there as darkness fell. She had studied with Tam for several years and knew how much the collection had meant to him. She sat down beside him in the ashes, not knowing what to say. They sat together in silence for a long while. Finally, Tam spoke, his voice hollow and distant. "The stories are gone. 40 years of work. Gone. I know. I am so sorry. I thought I was preserving something that mattered. I thought I was keeping the past alive. Now there is nothing." Lun was quiet for a moment, then said something that surprised even herself. "Master Tam, the people who told you those stories, are they less real because the records burned? Is my grandmother less my grandmother because the document you wrote about her family no longer exists?" Tam looked at her, not understanding at first. "The village is still here," Lun continued gently. "The people are still here. Their lives are still being lived, their stories still unfolding. Your records described those lives, but they were not the lives themselves. The map is not the territory. The story about something is not the something itself." Tam looked around at the ruins, then out at the village beyond, where lights were beginning to appear in windows as evening settled. The people were there, going about their lives, undiminished by the loss of the documents that described them. The fire had destroyed paper and ink, but it had not touched the living reality those papers had attempted to capture. "I confused the record with the thing recorded," he said slowly. "I thought the stories were what mattered most. But the stories were just reflections of something more real. And that something is still here. It does not depend on being written down. My grandmother existed fully before you ever recorded her history. She exists fully now, even though the record is gone. The writing pointed toward her, but it was never her." Tam sat with this as the night deepened. He thought about all the stories he had collected, all the careful documentation. It had been valuable work, and its loss was real. But Lun was right. The stories had always been secondary to the lives they described. The map had always been secondary to the territory. And more than that, he realized something about himself. He had defined himself by his work, by the stories he had preserved. But he existed before he began that work. He would continue to exist now that the work was destroyed. His identity did not depend on the collection any more than his grandmother's identity depended on the documents about her family. In the following weeks, Tam began to rebuild, though differently this time. He still valued stories and still believed in their importance. But he held them more lightly now. He understood that stories pointed towards something they could never fully capture, and that the something was always more real than the pointing. Buddhism shows us that our narratives about reality are useful but not ultimate. We tell stories to make sense of our experience, to communicate with others, to preserve what might otherwise be lost. These stories matter and deserve care, but they are always one step removed from the living reality they describe. The Buddha taught that we suffer when we cling to our concepts and narratives as if they were the things themselves. We mistake the menu for the meal, the map for the territory, the story for the life. When our stories are threatened or destroyed, we feel as if we ourselves are being erased. But the original face is not found in any story we tell about ourselves. It is what exists before any story begins, what remains when stories end, what holds all our narratives without being captured by any of them. Tam discovered this in the ashes of his life's work. The stories were gone, but the reality they had described remained, untouched by the fire. We can hold our own stories more lightly when we understand this. Our narratives about ourselves are meaningful, but they are not the final truth of who we are. Before our story began, we were already present. That presence has witnessed every chapter and will witness those yet to come. It is not a story. It is what stories are told about. Let us explore one more story that shows this teaching from another perspective. In a valley where 3 roads met, there lived a woman named Seki, who was known for her remarkable memory. She could recall conversations from decades ago, remember the exact words people had spoken, describe events from her childhood as if they had happened yesterday. People came to her when they needed to settle disputes about what had been said or agreed upon, trusting her memory more than their own. Seki had always taken pride in this ability. Her memories felt like treasures she carried with her, a vast collection of moments preserved in perfect detail. She believed that her memories were who she was, that without them she would be nothing but an empty vessel. As she grew older, she began to notice something troubling. Small gaps appeared in her memory. Names she should have known slipped away. Events she was certain she remembered clearly turned out to have happened differently than she recalled. The treasure chest she had relied upon was developing cracks, and precious things were falling through. She became anxious, then frightened. If her memories were failing, what would be left of her? Her entire sense of self was built upon the stories she remembered. Without them, who would she be? She lay awake at night, trying to hold on to memories that seemed to be dissolving like morning mist, gripping tighter and tighter to what was slipping away. One afternoon, she visited an old friend named Bara, who lived simply at the edge of the village. Bara had always seemed at peace in a way Seki envied, but did not understand. She confessed her fears about her fading memory, about losing herself piece by piece. Bara listened quietly, then asked a question Seki did not expect. "When you were born, did you have any memories?" "Of course not. Babies do not have memories. And yet you existed. You were fully yourself, a complete being, even without a single memory to your name." Bara poured tea for both of them, her movements unhurried. The memories came later. They accumulated year by year, experience by experience. But you were there first. The memories were added to you. You were not built from them. Seki considered this. She had never thought of it that way. She had always assumed that she was her memories, that the accumulation of stored experiences was what made her who she was. "Think of it this way," Bara continued. "Every night when you sleep, your memories become unavailable to you. During deep sleep, you have no access to your stories, no sense of your history. Are you gone during those hours? Do you cease to exist? No. I am still there. I wake up in the morning." Exactly. Something persists even when the memories are not available. Something is there before the memories return. That something is not made of memories. It is what has memories, what holds them, what witnesses them come and go. She sipped her tea calmly. "Your memories are precious. I do not dismiss their value. But they are like clothes you wear, not the body beneath. If some clothes wear out and must be set aside, you are not diminished. The body remains. The one who wore the clothes remains." Seki felt something releasing in her chest, a tension she had carried for months. So if I lose memories, I am not losing myself? You are losing stories about yourself. That is sad, and it is worth grieving. But the self that lived those stories is not contained in the stories. It was there before the stories began. It will be there when the stories fade. It is the original face that exists before and after any narrative, unchanged by what it holds. Seki walked home slowly that evening, feeling different than when she had set out. Her memory would continue to fade, she knew. More gaps would appear, more treasures would slip away. But she no longer felt that she was disappearing along with them. Something would remain, something that had been there before the first memory was formed. The stories might thin and scatter, but the one who had lived them would still be present, quiet and whole. Zen teaches us that memory and identity are not the same thing. We naturally feel that our memories make us who we are, that without them we would be nothing. But this is a kind of illusion, a confusion between the contents of awareness and awareness itself. The Buddha spoke of consciousness as something that exists independent of its objects. Memories are objects that appear in consciousness. They come and go, sharp at some times and faded at others. But the consciousness that holds them is not itself a memory. It is what makes memory possible in the first place. Seki discovered this truth when facing the loss of what she had always considered her most precious possession. Her memories were indeed fading, and that loss was real. But she came to see that she was not her memories any more than she was her clothes or her possessions. The original face existed before the first memory was formed. It remained present as memories accumulated. And it would remain when memories scattered like leaves in autumn wind. Our stories about ourselves are precious. Our memories are treasures worth honoring. But they rest upon something that has no story and holds no memories. This ground of awareness is the original face, present before any narrative began, unchanged by any tale that has been told. Let your body soften now, settling deeper into rest. Before your story began, you were already here. That presence remains, quiet and whole, holding whatever stories may come and go. Simply rest in that for a moment. When we ask a question, we usually want an answer. We ask because we do not know something, and we expect the question to lead us toward knowing. This is how questions work in daily life. Where did I put my keys? What time does the market close? How do I solve this problem? Each question points toward information we need, and when we find that information, the question dissolves. We have our answer, and we move on. But there is another kind of question, one that works very differently. These are questions that cannot be answered in the usual way. They do not lead to information that can be stated and stored. Instead, they open something in us. They point not toward facts, but toward direct experience. They are doorways rather than puzzles. Zen has long used such questions as tools for awakening. When a teacher asks a student, "Who are you?" the teacher is not looking for a name or a description. The question is meant to turn the student's attention inward, towards something that cannot be captured in any answer. The question opens rather than closes. It reveals rather than explains. The original face cannot be found through ordinary questioning. If we ask, "What is my original face?" and expect an answer we can think and say, we will be disappointed. The original face is not an object that can be described. It is closer to the one who is looking for it than any description could ever reach. But when we ask the question in a different spirit, not seeking information but simply looking, something can happen. The question becomes a kind of pointing, turning our attention toward what is always already here. Tonight we explore this way of asking, this questioning that opens rather than closes. Let us explore a story that shows how one woman discovered this. In a town where scholars gathered to study and debate, there lived a young woman named Ray who had devoted herself to understanding the nature of the mind. She had read every text she could find on the subject. She could discuss theories of consciousness with great sophistication, explaining different views and evaluating their strengths and weaknesses. Her knowledge was impressive, and her teachers praised her sharp intellect. But despite all her learning, Ray felt that something was missing. She could talk about the mind endlessly, but she was not sure she actually knew what the mind was. Her knowledge was like a map of a country she had never visited. The map was detailed and accurate, but it was not the same as standing on the actual ground. One afternoon, she decided to take a walk in the countryside to clear her head. The debates and discussions had been particularly intense lately, and she felt stuffed with words, overflowing with concepts that seemed to multiply without bringing her any closer to actual understanding. She followed a path through rice fields, grateful for the simple quiet of growing things. After walking for some time, she came to a small farmhouse where an old farmer named Doc was sitting on his porch, enjoying the afternoon sun. His face was deeply lined by years of outdoor work, but his eyes were clear and calm. He looked up as she approached and nodded a greeting. Something about his peaceful expression made Ray stop. She had been surrounded by scholars and intellectuals for so long, always discussing and debating. This simple farmer seemed to possess a quietness that all her learning had not given her. "May I rest here for a moment?" she asked. "Of course." He gestured to a wooden stool beside him. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the breeze move through the rice plants. Ray found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in the halls of study. "You look like someone who thinks a great deal," Doc observed finally. Ray smiled slightly. "I am a student. I study the nature of the mind." "Ah, and what have you learned?" She began to explain some of the theory she had studied, the different views of consciousness, the debates about perception and awareness. Doc listened with genuine interest, nodding occasionally, though it was clear much of what she said was unfamiliar to him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked a simple question that stopped her completely. "That is all very interesting. But right now, as we sit here, what is it that is aware of this conversation?" Ray opened her mouth to answer with one of her theories, but something made her pause. The question was not asking about theory. It was asking her to look directly at something happening right now, in this very moment. She turned her attention inward, trying to find what was aware of the conversation. She could notice thoughts arising. She could notice the sounds of the afternoon, the feeling of the breeze, the presence of the old farmer beside her. But what was doing the noticing? Where was the awareness itself? The more she looked, the more she realized she could not find it as an object. It was not a thing she could point to or describe, and yet it was undeniably present. Something was aware of this moment. Something was experiencing this conversation. But that something was not available to her in the way her theories were available. "I cannot find it," she said slowly. "I can notice what I am aware of, but I cannot find the awareness itself." Doc nodded, as if this were exactly what he expected. "You cannot find it because you are looking for it in the wrong place. You are looking for it as if it were something to be seen, but it is what sees. You cannot see your own eyes directly. You can only see what they show you." Ray sat with this. Her whole education had been about acquiring knowledge, about gathering information she could examine and analyze. But what Doc was pointing to could not be gathered or examined. It was too close, too fundamental. It was the very capacity that made examining possible. "All my studying," she said quietly, "all my theories and debates, they were about the mind, but they were not the mind itself." "A map of the ocean is useful," Doc replied, "but it is not wet. Your learning has given you many maps, but the territory they describe is right here, closer than your own breath. You do not need more maps. You need to feel the water." Ray stayed with the farmer until evening fell. They did not discuss theories or ideas. They simply sat together, and Ray practiced turning her attention toward the awareness that could not be found as an object. Each time she tried to grasp it, it slipped away. But each time she simply rested in it, it was obviously present, more intimate than any thought, more immediate than any theory. When she finally returned to her studies, something had changed. She still valued her learning, still engaged with ideas and debates, but she no longer confused the maps with the territory. She had touched something her books could never contain, something that was present before she opened any text and remained present after she closed them all. Zen teaches us that the deepest truths are not found through thinking alone. We can think about the original face, develop theories about it, debate its nature endlessly. But thinking about something is not the same as knowing it directly. The menu describes the food, but has no flavor. The map outlines the terrain, but has no mountains. We can become experts on a place we have never visited. The Buddha often pointed his students away from mere concepts and toward direct experience. He asked them to look, not just to think. He invited them to turn attention upon itself, to discover what was present before any thought arose. This kind of looking is different from ordinary investigation. It does not produce answers that can be written down and stored. It produces recognition, a direct seeing of what was always already here. Ray discovered that her vast learning, valuable as it was, had not given her what she most deeply sought. The farmer's simple question cut through all her theories and pointed her towards something immediate and undeniable. The awareness she was looking for was not hidden in a book. It was the very thing that was reading the books, hearing the question, seeking the answer. The original face reveals itself not through thinking, but through this kind of direct looking. We cannot capture it in words, but we can recognize it in experience. It is what is aware of these words right now. It is what is present before any question is asked and after any answer is given. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a monastery nestled in a mountain valley, there lived a monk named Toru who had practiced meditation for 30 years. He sat every morning before dawn and every evening after supper without fail. He followed all the teachings he had been given with dedication and sincerity. He kept the precepts, studied the texts, and served his community with humility, He was respected by his fellow monks for his discipline and his quiet manner. But despite 30 years of practice, Toru felt he had not broken through to anything fundamental. He had moments of peace, periods of calm, experiences that seemed meaningful at the time. But the deep awakening his teachers spoke of, the recognition of his true nature, had not come. He was beginning to wonder if it ever would. Sometimes in the early morning, before anyone else had risen, he would sit alone and feel a quiet despair. What was he doing wrong? What was he missing? His teacher, an elderly woman named Master Haru, had watched his struggle for many years. She knew that Toru was sincere, that he practiced diligently, that he genuinely sought the truth. But she also saw that something was blocking him, some subtle misunderstanding that kept him circling without arriving. One afternoon, she called him to her room for tea. They sat together in comfortable silence as she poured with careful attention. Then she spoke. "Toru, you have practiced for 30 years. What are you looking for?" "I am looking for my true nature, for awakening, for the original face the teachings speak of." "And in 30 years have you found it?" Toru lowered his eyes. "No. I have had experiences that seemed important, but nothing lasting. Nothing that felt like true recognition." Master Haru nodded slowly. "You have been looking for something to happen, some experience to arrive, some state to achieve. Is that not so?" "Yes, I suppose it is." "And where have you been looking?" Toru considered this. "In my meditation, in my practice, I have been watching my breath, watching my thoughts, waiting for something to reveal itself." "Waiting," Master Haru repeated. "For 30 years you have been waiting for your true nature to appear. But tell me, what was here before you started waiting? What was present before you began your first meditation, before you heard any teaching, before you started looking at all?" Toru was silent. He had never thought about it this way. His entire practice had been oriented toward achieving something, toward arriving somewhere he was not yet. He had never considered what was already present before the journey began. "I do not know," he admitted. "Then that is where to look. Not forward towards something you hope will happen. Backward, or rather inward, toward what was here before any practice started. You have been seeking what the search arises within. You have been trying to achieve what you already are." She poured more tea, her movements unhurried. The original face is not a reward for 30 years of practice. It is what has been present for all 30 years, watching you practice, waiting for you to notice. It was here before you came to this monastery. It will be here after you leave. It has never been absent for a single moment. You have simply been so busy looking for it that you have overlooked it." Toru felt something shifting in him, a reorientation of attention. He had been straining forward, always forward, trying to reach something ahead. Now he let that straining relax. He let his attention settle back, not toward any experience or state, but toward the simple fact of being aware, here, now. And in that settling, he noticed something he had somehow missed for 30 years. Awareness was already present. It had always been present. It was not something he needed to create or achieve. It was the very space in which all his striving had taken place. His 30 years of seeking had happened within what he was seeking. The original face had been looking out of his eyes all along, watching him search for it. "I was looking for my eyes with my eyes," he said softly. Master Haru smiled. "Now you begin to understand. The search was noble, and I do not dismiss your years of practice. But the searching mind could never find what it was looking for because it was looking outward for something that is always inward. Or rather, it is not inward or outward at all. It is what knows inward and outward. It is prior to all directions." Toru sat with his teacher as the afternoon light faded into evening. He did not feel that he had achieved anything. He felt, instead, that he had stopped achieving. He had stopped reaching for something ahead and had simply recognized what was already here. It was so simple, so obvious, that he almost laughed. 30 years of searching for something that had never been missing for a single moment. He thought about all the mornings he had sat in the meditation hall, straining toward enlightenment. All the evenings he had examined his mind, looking for signs of progress. All the years of effort and discipline, all motivated by the belief that what he sought was somewhere ahead, waiting to be reached. And all along, it had been right here, the very awareness within which all his seeking had taken place. "What do I do now?" he asked. Master Haru laughed softly. "Now you live. You continue to practice, but without the burden of seeking. You sit, but without waiting for something to happen. You walk through your days knowing that what you sought is what is doing the walking. Nothing has changed, and everything has changed." Buddhism shows us that what we seek is not separate from what is seeking. The awareness that looks for the original face is itself an expression of the original face. The one who asks, "Who am I?" is closer to the answer than any answer could ever be. The Buddha spoke of the mind turning to see itself, a kind of recognition rather than acquisition. We do not gain our true nature through practice. We recognize that it was never absent. All our seeking and striving happens within what we are seeking. The journey home is the discovery that we never left. Toru spent 30 years looking in the wrong direction. He was oriented toward the future, toward some experience that would someday arrive. What Master Haru helped him see was that the original face is not in the future. It is not waiting at the end of any path. It is the ground on which all paths are walked, the awareness within which all experiences arise. This is why the question, "Who am I?" works differently than ordinary questions. It is not seeking information. It is turning attention toward its own source. When we ask sincerely and then simply look, we discover that the one who is looking is what we were looking for. Let us explore one more story that shows this teaching. In a village where 3 mountain streams came together, there lived an old woman named Kisa, who was known for her unusual way of teaching. She never lectured or explained. She never gave answers to questions. Instead, she would ask questions of her own, simple questions that seemed to open doors in people's minds. Some found her maddening, preferring teachers who would simply tell them what they needed to know. Others found her liberating, discovering through her questions things they could never have been told. A young man named Nobu came to her one day with a problem that had troubled him for years. He had been trying to understand himself through reading and practice. He had attended teachings, followed methods, sat in meditation, but he felt no closer to knowing who he really was. The question, "Who am I?" had become a kind of torment, always present, never answered. He hoped Kisa could give him some insight, some key that would unlock the mystery that he himself seemed to be. Kisa was sitting by the stream when he arrived, watching the water flow over smooth stones. She did not look up as he approached, but gestured for him to sit beside her. "I have come to ask you a question," Nobu said. "Ask." "Who am I? I have been trying to understand this for years, but I cannot find the answer." Kisa was silent for a long moment, watching the water. Then she said, "That is a good question. But I have a question for you first." "Who is asking?" Nobu was confused. "I am asking." Nobu is asking. Nobu is a name. Names are given to things so we can talk about them. But I am not asking for a name. I am asking, who is the one using that name? Who is the one who wants to know who he is? Nobu tried to answer, but everything he could say felt like another label, another description. He was a man, a seeker, a student, a person from this village. But none of these descriptions felt like they touched what Kisa was asking about. "I do not know how to answer," he admitted. "Good. Now we are getting somewhere." Kisa turned to look at him directly. "You have been looking for who you are, as if you were looking for an object you had lost. You search your pockets, you look under furniture, you ask others if they have seen it. But what you are looking for is not an object. It is what is doing the looking." She pointed at the stream. "Can the water see itself flow? Can the eye see itself directly? You are trying to make yourself into an object you can examine. But you are not an object. You are the examining itself." Nobu stared at the stream, watching the water move endlessly over the stones. He had never considered this before. He had always assumed that if he looked hard enough, long enough, he would find himself the way he might find anything else. But what Kisa was pointing to was different. The one doing the looking could never be found as a thing being looked at. "Then how will I ever know who I am?" Kisa smiled gently. "You already know. You have always known. But you keep looking for the knowing as if it was something other than what is already happening. Right now, you are aware. You do not need to search for that awareness. It is already here. It is what is hearing my words, feeling the breeze, watching the water. That awareness is not Nobu. It is what Nobu arises within. It is the original face, present before any name was given, unchanged by any experience." She turned back to the water. "Stop looking for yourself as if you were lost. You are the one who would do the finding. Rest in that, and the question dissolves. Not because you find an answer, but because you recognize that what you were looking for was doing the looking all along." Nobu sat by the stream with Kisa for a long time that afternoon. He did not try to understand what she had said with his thinking mind. He simply let her words point him towards something more immediate. The awareness that was present right now. The knowing that was already happening. The presence that had been here before he asked any question at all. The stream continued to flow, endless and unhurried. The afternoon light softened as the sun moved lower in the sky. Birds called from the trees along the bank. And through it all, something was aware, something was present, something that had never needed to be found because it had never been lost. In that simple sitting, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or special experiences. Just a quiet recognition that what he had been seeking was not somewhere else. It was here. It had always been here. The search had been happening within what he was searching for. The one who wanted to find himself was the very self he wanted to find. When Nobu finally rose to leave, he bowed deeply to Kisa. She nodded and turned back to the stream as if nothing remarkable had happened. And perhaps nothing had, except that a young man had stopped looking outside for what could only be found within, had stopped seeking ahead for what was already present, had stopped trying to become what he already was. Zen teaches us that the original face is not found at the end of a search. It is recognized as what was present before the search began. The question, "Who am I?" is most powerful not when it leads to an answer, but when it turns attention toward the one who is asking. The Buddha did not teach people to find new things. He taught them to recognize what they had overlooked. The awakening he pointed toward was not an achievement, but a recognition. We wake up to what was always here, not to something newly arrived. Kisa understood this deeply. She did not answer Nobu's question because the answer would have just been more words, more concepts, more things for him to examine as objects. Instead, she turned his attention around, pointed him toward the one who was asking. In that turning, the question dissolves, not because it is answered, but because it is seen through. What we seek is what is seeking. What we want to find is what is doing the finding. Let your breath settle into its natural rhythm now. You do not need to find anything in this moment. The awareness that is hearing these words, that is resting in this darkness, that is simply present, this is closer to your original face than any answer could ever be. Simply rest here. We have traveled far together tonight, exploring the teaching of the original face from many directions. We have seen how it exists before our names and roles, before our knowledge and accomplishments, before our stories and memories. We have noticed the unchanging awareness that witnesses all the changes of our lives. We have discovered that the deepest questions open us rather than lead us to answers. Now we come to something simple and profound. The original face is not something we need to find. It is not waiting for us at the end of a journey. It is not hidden in some distant place we have not yet reached. It is here, now, closer than our own breath. It has been here all along. The search for who we truly are is perhaps the strangest search of all. We look everywhere for something that is doing the looking. We travel far to discover where we have always been. We work hard to achieve what we already are. The journey home is the recognition that we never left. This is not just a poetic way of speaking. It points to something we can notice directly. Right now, awareness is present. Right now, something is experiencing this moment. That something did not arrive recently and will not depart soon. It has been the constant companion of every moment of our lives, so familiar that we overlooked it, so close that we could not see it. Tonight we complete our exploration by resting in this recognition, not striving for anything new, not seeking what is not here, but simply noticing what has always been present. The original face greets us when we finally stop running toward it and simply turn around. Let us explore a story that shows how one man came to this recognition. In a land of wide plains and distant mountains, there lived a man named Koto, who had spent 20 years searching for truth. As a young man, he had felt a deep calling, a sense that something important was waiting to be discovered. He left his home and family and set out to find it. He traveled to many places. He sat at the feet of famous teachers and learned their methods. He crossed vast territories to study with masters who were spoken of in whispers. He practiced disciplines that promised transformation, sitting for hours in meditation, following strict regimens that were supposed to purify the mind. He read texts that claimed to hold the secrets of existence, ancient manuscripts that had been copied and preserved for generations. Some of what he found was valuable. He learned to quiet his mind, to see through certain illusions, to let go of attachments that had caused him pain. He had experiences that seemed meaningful at the time, glimpses of something vast and peaceful that would fade when he tried to hold on to them. But the deepest truth, the final recognition he sought, always seemed just out of reach. Each teacher pointed him toward the next. Each practice prepared him for something that never quite arrived. The goal was always ahead, never here. By the time 20 years had passed, Koto was tired. His hair had begun to gray, and his body no longer moved with the ease of youth. He had given everything to his search, and he was no longer sure it had been worth it. Perhaps there was no final truth. Perhaps the seeking itself was a kind of illusion. One autumn, he decided to return home. Not because he had found what he was looking for, but because he had nowhere else to go. The road back was long, and he walked it slowly, no longer in a hurry to arrive anywhere. When he finally reached his childhood village, he barely recognized it. New buildings had been built, and old ones had crumbled. The people had aged, and many he remembered had passed away. The Sakainj and Achen had ancient sens. The people had aged in the file. He found his way to the house where he had grown up, now just ruins overgrown with vines and wild grass. He sat down among the crumbling stones where he had once played as a child. Weeds grew through cracks in what had been the floor. The roof had long since fallen in. There was nothing left of the home he remembered except these broken remnants. And yet, sitting there, something unexpected happened. A feeling washed over him that he had not experienced in 20 years of seeking. A sense of presence, of simple being, of coming home. Not to the ruined house, but to something else. Something that had been here when he was a child, before he knew anything about spiritual paths or teachings or truth. He remembered himself as a boy, sitting in this very spot, watching clouds drift across the sky. He remembered the feeling of the grass beneath him, the warmth of the sun, the simple joy of being alive without needing it to be anything special. He had not been seeking anything then. He had simply been present, aware, alive. That presence had not required any teaching to exist. It had not needed any practice to sustain it. It had simply been here, natural and effortless, like breathing. And now, sitting in the ruins of that childhood home, he realized with a shock of recognition that it was still here. The same presence, the same simple awareness. It had not changed in all these years. It had not been improved by his practices or diminished by his failures. It had not grown wiser through his studies or weaker through his doubts. It had accompanied him through every moment of his search, so constant that he had overlooked it entirely, so close that he could not see it. He began to laugh quietly to himself. 20 years of traveling, seeking, striving, and what he had been looking for had never been somewhere else. It had been here all along, the very awareness that had done the searching. He had traveled the world looking for his own eyes. The ruins did not matter. The house could crumble completely, and what he had found would remain. Because what he had found was not in any place. It was what new places. It was not any experience. It was what experienced. It had been here before the house was built and was here after it had fallen. An old woman from the village found him sitting there as evening approached. She had known him as a child and recognized him despite the years. "You have returned," she said simply. "Yes." I searched everywhere for something I thought was missing, and I found it here, in these ruins, where I started. The old woman nodded, as if this made perfect sense. The longest journeys sometimes bring us back to where we began. But we see it differently when we return. I see that what I was looking for never left this place. Or rather, it never left me. I carried it with me through all my travels without knowing. The seeking was happening within what I sought. I just could not see it because I was looking outward for something that was always inward. Or rather, not inward or outward at all. Just here. Always here. He stayed in the village for the rest of his days. He did not become a teacher or gather students. He simply lived quietly, helping where he could, present to each moment as it came. When people asked about his years of searching, he would tell them honestly what he had found. I traveled far and learned many things. But the most important thing I discovered was that what I sought had never been missing. I was looking for home while standing in my own living room. The original face was looking out of my eyes the whole time, watching me search for it. Zen teaches us that awakening is not achievement, but recognition. We do not create our true nature through effort. We do not earn it through practice. We simply recognize what was always here, what we somehow overlooked while looking everywhere else. The Buddha spoke of the mind's natural clarity, its inherent wakefulness. This clarity is not produced by meditation or study. It is revealed when we stop obscuring it with our seeking and striving. The clouds part, and we see that the sun was shining all along. Koto discovered this in the ruins of his childhood home. 20 years of searching had brought him back to where he started, but now he could see what he had missed before. The presence that was here when he was a child had never left. It had accompanied him through all his journeys, so constant that he could not see it, so intimate that he did not recognize it. This is the great joke at the heart of the spiritual search. We look everywhere for what is doing the looking. We strive to become what we already are. We journey far to discover that we never left home. When we finally stop and simply notice, we find that what we sought was present all along, patiently waiting for us to stop running long enough to recognize it. Let us explore another story that reveals more of this teaching. In a village beside a quiet lake, there lived an elderly woman named Sen, who had spent her whole life feeling incomplete. Since childhood, she had carried a sense that she was not yet who she was supposed to be, that the real Sen was waiting somewhere ahead, a better version she had not yet become. This feeling had driven her through the years. She had worked hard to improve herself, to develop her character, to become worthy of respect and love. She had raised children with devoted care, served her community with generosity, tried to live according to her highest values. She had apologized for her mistakes, tried to learn from her failures, always striving to grow into the person she felt she should be. And yet the sense of incompleteness never left. No matter what she accomplished, no matter how she grew, she still felt she had not arrived at her true self. There was always some gap between who she was and who she should be. The finish line kept moving ahead of her, no matter how fast she ran. Now she was old, her hair white, her body slowing with age. She had less time ahead of her than behind, and the incompleteness she had carried all her life had become a quiet ache. Would she ever become who she was meant to be? Or would she die still waiting, still not quite ready, still not quite herself? The question haunted her quiet moments, a sadness she had never been able to resolve. One afternoon, her granddaughter Amy came to visit. Amy was only 5 years old, still new to the world, full of wonder at everything she encountered. She climbed into Sen's lap the way she always did and looked at her grandmother's face with simple attention. Children look differently than adults. They have not yet learned to see through the filters of judgment and expectation. They simply see what is there, without adding or subtracting anything. Amy looked at Sen for a long moment. Then she said, "I see you, grandmother." Something about these simple words reached Sen in a place nothing had touched before. I see you. Not the improved version she was trying to become. Not the ideal she had always fallen short of. Just her, as she was. Right now, Sen felt tears beginning to fall, though she was not sad. Something was releasing. Some knot that had been tied for as long as she could remember. "What do you see?" she asked her granddaughter. Amy considered this seriously, the way children do. "I see your eyes. They are kind. I see your hands. They are soft. I see you, grandmother. You are here. You are here." Such simple words. And yet they unlocked something Sen had been unable to reach on her own. She realized, sitting there with her granddaughter's warm weight in her lap, that she had been waiting her whole life for permission to be herself. She had been waiting to become good enough, complete enough, worthy enough. But the self she had been waiting to become was already here. It had always been here. There was no improved version waiting in the future. There was only this woman, this moment, this presence that a child could see so clearly. "I have been waiting to become myself," she said softly, more to herself than to Amy. "But I was already here. I was always already here." The sense of incompleteness did not disappear entirely in that moment. It had been her companion for too long to vanish in an afternoon. But something had shifted at its root. She had glimpsed the truth that her granddaughter saw so naturally. The original face does not need to be improved or completed. It does not need to become anything other than what it is. It is already whole, already enough, already home. In the months that followed, Sen found herself returning to that moment again and again. Whenever the old feeling of incompleteness arose, she would remember Amy's simple words. "I see you. You are here." She would let herself rest in the presence that needed no improvement, the self that was already whole. She had spent her whole life running toward a better version of herself. Now she was learning to stop running and simply be where she was. The original face had been waiting for her, not ahead in some imagined future, but right here, in this moment, in this body, in this life. It had been waiting with infinite patience for her to stop striving long enough to notice. Buddhism shows us that our true nature is not something we create through effort. We cannot manufacture the original face through self-improvement. We cannot earn it through achievement. We cannot become worthy of it through striving. It is not waiting for us at the end of any path. It is the ground on which we stand right now, the awareness in which all our striving happens. The Buddha taught that we suffer because we are always reaching for something else, always trying to become something other than what we are. We believe that happiness is in the next moment, the next accomplishment, the next version of ourselves. We run toward a future that keeps receding, never arriving at a present that is always here. But happiness, like our true nature, is only ever available now. It is only ever found here, in this moment, in this breath. Zen discovered this through her granddaughter's innocent eyes. The child saw what Zen had been unable to see in herself for 80 years. Not someone incomplete, not someone who needed to become better, but simply a person who was here, present, whole. The original face does not need our improvements. It needs only our recognition. It needs only for us to stop running long enough to notice that we have already arrived. We can let ourselves rest in this. The striving can soften. The reaching can ease. What we are looking for is not ahead of us. It is what is looking. It is not something we will become. It is what we have always been. Coming home to the original face is simply stopping long enough to notice that we are already here. We have journeyed together tonight through the teaching of the original face. We have explored who we are beneath the names we carry, beneath the knowledge we have gathered, beneath the things we have created, and the stories we have told. We have seen that something was present before any of these layers were added. Before we learned our names, before we formed our first memory, before anyone told us who we should become, we were already here. That original presence has never left us. It has witnessed every moment of our lives without being changed by any of them. The original face is not distant or difficult to find. It is closer than our own breath, more intimate than our own thoughts. It is what is aware of these words right now. It is what has been listening all evening. We do not need to seek it, because it is what does the seeking. We do not need to become it, because it is what we already are. Tonight, as you rest, there is nothing more to figure out and nothing more to achieve. The layers can soften. The roles can fall away. The stories can quiet. What remains needs nothing added to it. It has been whole since before the beginning of your life. It will remain whole after everything else has changed. You do not need to remember these teachings. You do not need to hold on to anything from this evening. The original face cannot be forgotten because it is not a memory. It is what remembers. It is what rests. It is what wakes again tomorrow. Simply let yourself be held by what has always been here. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.